Hello, everyone, and welcome back to X-Ranger. Before we begin, I thought it would be interesting if each of you could leave a comment indicating which part of the world you're joining us from. Also, don't forget to like and subscribe if you're enjoying the episodes. Now let's get comfortable, relax, and start our program. I've spent the last 3 weeks trying to make sense of what happened to me on September 28th in the Cascade Mountains. I'm still shaking as I type this. I've always been skeptical about Bigfoot stories. I mean, who hasn't rolled their eyes at those blurry photos and sensational TV shows? But what I experienced that day, it changed everything I thought I knew. I'm an experienced hiker, been doing solo trips in Washington State for about 8 years now. That Thursday morning started like any other hiking day. I left my house in Everett around 5:30 a.m., heading to the Mountain Loop Highway near Granite Falls. There's this lesser-known trail I frequent that branches off from the Gothic Basin route. I'm deliberately being vague about the exact location because I honestly don't want anyone going there looking for what I saw. The weather was typical for late September in the Cascades. Overcast, about 52 degrees Fahrenheit, with a light mist that came and went. I parked my Subaru Outback at the trailhead around 7:15 a.m. There were no other cars in the lot, which wasn't unusual for a weekday. I remember checking my backpack one last time. Water, trail mix, first aid kit, my Swiss Army knife, and my Nikon camera. I'd been hoping to photograph some early fall colors. The first 2 hours of the hike were completely normal. The trail was wet but not muddy, and the forest was alive with the usual sounds. Birds, the rustle of small animals, the wind in the trees. I'd gone about 4 miles in, reaching an elevation of around 3,800 feet, when things started feeling different. It's hard to explain, but anyone who spends time in the woods knows that feeling when something's not right. The first thing I noticed was the birds. They just stopped. Not gradually, but all at once, like someone had hit a mute button. I've experienced this before when there's a predator around, usually a bear or cougar, so I immediately became alert. I took out my bear spray and continued walking, but more cautiously. That's when I noticed the smell. I've encountered plenty of wild animals, but this was different. It was this overwhelming, pungent odor, like a mix of wet dog, rotting vegetation, and something musky I can't even describe. It was so strong it made my eyes water. I stopped walking and looked around, trying to figure out where it was coming from. Then I heard it, a sound that still haunts me. From somewhere in the dense forest to my left came this deep, rumbling breath. Not like a bear's grunt or anything I'd heard before. It was almost human-like, but deeper and more powerful than any human could produce. My heart started racing, and I felt this primal urge to run, but I forced myself to stay still. That's when I saw movement through the trees, about 40 yards away. At first I thought it was a bear standing up, but as I focused on it, I realized with growing horror that what I was looking at was way too tall to be a bear. The thing was massive. I'd estimate at least 8 feet tall. It was standing upright, partially hidden behind a large western red cedar, but clearly bipedal. Its body was covered in dark, almost black hair that looked matted in some places. But it was the face that turned my blood to ice. Through the branches, I could see its eyes. They were dark, but had this intelligence in them that felt almost human. They were fixed right on me. The face was something between an ape and a human, with a pronounced brow ridge and a wider, flatter nose than a human's. I stood there frozen for what felt like minutes, but was probably only seconds. My hands were shaking so bad I couldn't even get my camera out. Then it moved. It took one step forward, and the way it moved, it was so fluid, so deliberate. That's when I completely lost it. I turned and started running back down the trail. I could hear it moving through the forest parallel to the trail. The sound of snapping branches and heavy footfalls was overwhelming. It was keeping pace with me easily, which was terrifying considering I was sprinting downhill as fast as I safely could. Every few seconds, I could hear these deep, powerful breaths from the tree line. What happened next is still vivid in my mind. I heard it crash through the underbrush toward the trail ahead of me. I skidded to a stop and changed direction, scrambling up a steep embankment to my right. I could hear it changing direction too, the heavy footfalls getting closer. The smell was overwhelming now. I reached the top of the embankment and found myself in a small clearing. That's when I saw it in full view for the first time. It emerged from the trees about 30 yards away, standing fully upright. The size of it, photos or descriptions, can't prepare you for seeing something like that in person. Its shoulders were incredibly broad, and its arms were proportionally longer than a human's, hanging down past its knees. The hair covering its body was a dark brown-black, but had some reddish tints where the light hit it. But it was the way it looked at me that I'll never forget. There was an intelligence there that was unmistakable. It wasn't the look of a predator sizing up prey. It was more like curiosity mixed with, I don't know, maybe territoriality. It took another step toward me, and I noticed how its feet were huge but distinctly human-like in shape. I backed away slowly, my heart pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. It made this sound then, not quite a growl, not quite a grunt, but something in between. The sound seemed to reverberate in my chest. That's when I remembered the bear spray in my hand. I don't know if bear spray even works on whatever this was, but I wasn't going to wait to find out. I turned and ran again, crashing through the underbrush, no longer caring about staying on the trail. I could hear it moving behind me, but it wasn't charging. It was just keeping pace, almost like it was escorting me out of its territory. The sounds of its movement continued for what felt like forever, but was probably only about 10 minutes. Finally, I broke through onto the main trail, and the footsteps behind me stopped. The birds were still silent. I didn't stop running until I reached my car. My hands were shaking so badly it took me 3 tries to get my key in the door. As I drove away, I kept checking my rearview mirror, half expecting to see it emerge from the tree line. When I got home, I noticed my clothes were covered in mud and torn in places from running through the brush. I had scratches on my arms I didn't even remember getting. My hiking boots, which I'd just cleaned the week before, were caked in mud and had some kind of hair stuck to them. Dark, coarse strands about 3-4 inches long. I put them in a plastic bag, but by the time I thought to take them somewhere to be analyzed a few days later, they had somehow disappeared from my garage. I still don't know what happened to them. It's been 3 weeks, and I haven't told many people about this. How do you even begin to tell this kind of story without sounding crazy? I haven't been back to those trails, and honestly, I don't know if I ever will. I used to think Bigfoot was just a fun story, something to tell around campfires. Now, I don't know what to think. All I know is that what I saw was real, it was intelligent, and it was definitely not a bear or any other known animal. Every time I close my eyes, I can still see those eyes looking at me. They weren't animal eyes. There was something else there, something that made me question everything I thought I knew about what exists in our forests. I don't expect anyone to believe me, but I needed to write this down, to tell someone. Whatever I encountered out there, it was real, and it's still out there in the Cascades. Story 2. I never thought I'd go back to Mount Rainier after what happened to me last summer. Anyone who's been through something like that would probably think I'm crazy for returning. Maybe I am. But after months of sleepless nights and endless questions, I knew I had to know if what I saw was real. This time, I convinced my buddy Mike, who's an experienced hunter and tracker, to come with me. He didn't believe my story at first. Nobody did. But he agreed to help me investigate, if only to prove I was wrong. We headed out on September 15th, 2023. The weather forecast showed clear skies, which was rare for the area. We packed enough supplies for 3 days, camping gear, trail cameras, plaster for casting footprints, and our rifles, just in case. Mike brought his hunting dog Thor, a German shepherd he'd trained himself. I remembered the exact location from my first encounter, about 4 miles up the Wonderland Trail, then off-path toward the eastern ridge. We started early, around 6 a.m. The morning air was crisp, probably around 45 degrees Fahrenheit, and there was still some fog lingering between the trees. Everything seemed normal at first. Thor was excited, running ahead and sniffing around like usual. We hiked for about 3 hours, following my GPS coordinates from last time. The whole way up, I kept getting these waves of dread, like my body was screaming at me to turn back. But I had to know. Around 10:30 a.m., we reached the general area where I had my first encounter. My hands were shaking as I pointed out the clearing to Mike. He was scanning the tree line with his binoculars while I set up some trail cameras. That's when Thor's behavior changed completely. He went from excited to nervous, tucking his tail and whining, something Mike said he'd never seen him do before. The air felt different too, heavier somehow, and there was this smell, not quite like rotting meat, but something musky and wild that made my stomach turn. We heard it first, a deep, resonating wood knock that seemed to echo through the trees. Mike froze mid-step. "That wasn't a woodpecker," he whispered. Before I could respond, another knock came from the opposite direction, then another. They were answering each other. Thor pressed against Mike's leg, trembling. The forest went dead silent. No birds, no squirrels, nothing. Just that oppressive silence that I remembered from last time. Mike reached for his rifle, and I could see his hands shaking too. That's when we saw the first one. It emerged from behind a massive cedar about 100 yards away. Even from that distance I could tell it was huge, at least 8 feet tall, with dark reddish-brown hair covering its entire body. Its movements were smooth, almost human-like, but more powerful. Mike raised his rifle but didn't fire. We both knew shooting would be a mistake. Then we saw the second one moving through the trees to our left, and a third to our right. They were coordinating, surrounding us. These weren't just animals acting on instinct. They were hunting us with intelligence. Thor was practically crawling now, whimpering. The closest one was about 50 yards away when we heard something that still haunts my nightmares. A scream that started like a woman's cry, but turned into something deeper, more primal. It came from behind us, and when we spun around, there was a fourth creature, closer than the others, blocking our path back. We were trapped. Mike was muttering, "This isn't possible," over and over. I was sure we were going to die there. That's when something even stranger happened, something I'm still trying to make sense of. A whistle cut through the air, sharp and clear, definitely human-made. About 30 yards to our right, we saw a figure step out from behind a tree. It was a person, dressed in dark clothing, but something about them seemed off. They raised their arms and made a series of quick, sharp gestures. To our shock, the creatures responded. The closest one took a step back. The figure motioned to us, a clear signal to move. We didn't need to be told twice. Keeping our eyes on the creatures, we backed away slowly in the direction the figure had indicated. The creatures watched, but didn't follow. They made these low, rumbling sounds that you could feel in your chest, but they kept their distance. We half walked, half ran for what felt like hours, though it was probably only 45 minutes. Thor led the way, seeming to know exactly where to go. When we finally stopped to catch our breath, the figure was gone. We tried to find tracks or any sign of them, but there was nothing. The rest of our hike out is a blur. We didn't stop until we reached the parking lot, and we didn't say a word the whole way. All our fancy equipment, the trail cameras, everything. We left it all behind. It wasn't worth going back for. Mike's different now. We both are. He sold his hunting gear and hasn't gone back to the woods since. Thor won't even go for walks near the tree line anymore. As for me, I can't stop thinking about that figure who helped us. Who were they? How did they know how to communicate with those creatures? There are rumors, stories from the local tribes about people who live in the deep woods, who understand the forest giants, but I never believed them until now. I've spent countless hours researching since then, trying to find similar encounters. There are more than you'd think, but people are afraid to talk about them. They're afraid of sounding crazy, of being laughed at. I get it now, but I also know what I saw. Those weren't just animals, and that wasn't just some random person who helped us. There's something going on in those mountains, something bigger than Bigfoot stories and campfire tales. The weirdest part, sometimes, on really quiet nights, I hear those wood knocks coming from the forest behind my house. They're distant, but distinct, and occasionally I catch that same musky scent on the wind. I've installed security cameras and motion sensors around my property. Most nights they don't pick up anything, but sometimes they catch shadows moving between the trees. Shadows that are too tall and too fluid to be human. I know how this sounds. If someone had told me this story 2 years ago, I would have thought they were making it up or had seen a bear. But there's a reason so many people have similar stories about Mount Rainier. There's a reason the local tribes have centuries of oral history about these creatures. They're real, they're intelligent, and they're not alone out there. I won't be going back to investigate again. Some questions are better left unanswered, but I wonder about that figure sometimes, and about how many other people they've helped. How long have they been out there? How much do they know? And most importantly, what else is happening in those mountains that we don't know about? I'm sharing this now because people need to know the truth about what's out there. Not the sensationalized stories or the hoaxes, but the real encounters. These creatures are real, they're organized, and they're far more intelligent than we give them credit for. And they're not the only ones living in those woods. If you're planning to hike Mount Rainier, stick to the marked trails. Don't go wandering off path like we did. And if you hear wood knocks or smell something strange, turn back immediately. You're being watched, and you're not equipped to handle what might be watching you. As for me, I'm moving away from Washington next month. I can't live with these forests looming over me anymore, knowing what's out there. Some people might call me a coward for running, but they haven't seen what I've seen. They haven't heard that scream or looked into those eyes. They don't wake up at 3 a.m. every night, sure that something is watching their house from the tree line. I don't know if that figure who helped us will ever read this. Part of me hopes they do. I want to thank them for saving our lives that day. But another part of me hopes this story serves as a warning to others. There are things in those mountains that defy explanation, and sometimes the smartest thing you can do is walk away and never look back. Story 3. It was October 12th, 2023, around 8:30 p.m. Mike and I were heading back from a job site near Cedro Woolley, driving my 2019 Ford F-150. It was one of those typical Pacific Northwest evenings, misty, with a light drizzle that made the road gleam under the headlights. The weather report had mentioned fog rolling in later, but at that point, visibility was still decent. We were about 15 miles east of Arlington when I first noticed something was off. The woods on either side of Highway 9 are usually alive with noise, even at night, but everything had gone eerily quiet. Even the rain hitting the truck seemed muffled somehow. Mike was scrolling through his phone when he suddenly looked up and asked if I'd seen something move in the tree line. I hadn't, but that's when I noticed the smell, this overwhelming rancid odor like rotting meat mixed with wet dog. It was so strong it was seeping into the truck even with the windows up. I slowed down to about 45 miles per hour, thinking maybe a deer was about to cross. That's when we saw it. In my high beams, about 100 yards ahead on the right shoulder, something massive stepped out from behind a thick cedar. At first, my brain tried to make sense of it, maybe a bear standing up. But bears don't stand 8, 9 feet tall, and they don't move like this thing did. It was covered in dark, matted fur, with incredibly long arms that hung down past its knees. The way it moved was disturbingly human-like, but wrong somehow. My hands were shaking on the steering wheel, and I could hear Mike saying, "Holy shit," over and over under his breath. The creature turned its head toward our truck, and I caught a glimpse of its face in the headlights. It had deep-set eyes that reflected red in the light like a predator's. But what really got to me was the intelligence in those eyes. This wasn't some animal acting on instinct. It was watching us, analyzing us. I should have floored it right then, but I was frozen. That's when Mike started smacking my arm and pointing to the left side of the road. There was another one, emerging from the shadows between the trees. Then a third, further ahead. They were surrounding us. Finally, my survival instincts kicked in. I slammed on the gas, and the truck's engine roared as we accelerated. The creatures actually started running alongside us, not in the clumsy way a bear runs, but in powerful, coordinated strides. They were keeping pace with a truck going 60 miles per hour, like it was nothing. The one on the right suddenly veered toward us. I swerved to avoid it, but it swung one of those massive arms and hit the passenger side mirror, ripping it clean off. The sound of metal tearing was horrible. Mike was yelling at me to go faster, but I was already pushing 70 on a wet, dark road. What happened next still doesn't seem possible. One of them, the largest one, I think, got ahead of us and actually tried to stop the truck. It braced itself in the middle of the road, feet planted wide, and reached out with both hands as we hit it. The impact should have killed it. Instead, it slid backward about 20 feet, leaving deep gouges in the asphalt, while my truck suddenly felt like I'd hit a concrete barrier. The hood crumpled like paper, and the engine made a sickening grinding noise. Somehow, I kept control of the vehicle. The creature had been knocked down, but it got up immediately, seemingly unharmed. I yanked the wheel hard to the left, managing to swerve around it. The engine was damaged but still running. Black smoke was pouring from under the hood, and the temperature gauge was climbing fast. The next few minutes were pure terror. We could hear them running through the woods on both sides of the highway, keeping pace with us. Every few seconds, one would emerge from the tree line, getting closer and closer to the truck. They were herding us, I realized, like wolves coordinating to exhaust their prey. My truck was dying. The engine was making horrible noises, and we were losing speed. I knew we couldn't outrun them much longer. That's when I saw the lights of several semi-trucks up ahead, heading our way. The creatures must have seen them too, because they suddenly backed off. The last thing I saw in my rearview mirror was 3 massive shapes melting back into the forest, moving with an agility that seemed impossible for their size. We limped the truck into Arlington, running on pure adrenaline. The front end was completely smashed in, the passenger mirror was gone, and there were deep dents in the passenger door. The hood had massive hand-shaped depressions in it, and there were weird dark hairs caught in the crumpled metal. I wanted to save them as evidence, but by the time we got to a safe place to stop, the rain had washed them away. We filed a police report, but of course we didn't tell them what really happened. How could we? We said we'd hit a deer, but the officer who took the report kept looking at the damage with this confused expression. I don't blame him. The damage didn't match any normal accident pattern. The insurance company totaled my truck. The frame was bent in ways their investigators couldn't explain. Mike and I have only talked about that night a few times since it happened. He won't drive Highway 9 anymore, and I don't blame him. I still have to use it sometimes for work, but only during broad daylight, and my new truck has the biggest LED light bar money can buy. I've spent countless hours researching since then, trying to understand what we encountered. I've found other reports from that area, dating back decades, but none quite like what we experienced. The coordinated attack, the obvious intelligence they displayed, the impossible strength, it all suggests these creatures are far more dangerous and organized than most people believe. The thing that really haunts me isn't just what happened, but what could have happened if those semi-trucks hadn't come along. Those creatures were shepherding us somewhere. They had a plan. Sometimes I lie awake at night wondering how many other people they've trapped on that dark stretch of highway, and what happened to the ones who didn't get away. I know how this story sounds. If someone had told me this a year ago, I would have thought they were crazy or lying. I've worked in construction for 15 years. I'm not some guy who believes in conspiracies or goes looking for monsters, but I know what I saw, what we both saw. Those things were real, they were intelligent, and they were hunting us. The weirdest part, about a week after it happened, I drove back out there in my rental car in the middle of the day. I wanted to see the road damage, maybe find some evidence. But there was nothing. The gouges in the asphalt where that thing had tried to stop my truck, they were gone. Completely smooth road, like it never happened. But I have a $45,000 insurance claim and the nightmares to prove it did. Story 4. It all started back in September 2023. I was doing some solo hiking in the Gifford Pinchot National Forest in Washington State, about 15 miles east of the small town of Cougar. I'm an experienced hiker, been doing it for over a decade now, and I always follow proper safety protocols. That day started like any other. Clear skies, temperature around 45 degrees Fahrenheit, perfect conditions for a day hike. I'd parked my truck at the Lava Canyon trailhead around 7 a.m., planning to explore some of the less traveled paths I'd heard about from local hiking groups. The morning was quiet. Too quiet, looking back on it now. Usually, you'd hear birds, small animals, the whole forest wake-up routine. But there was this stillness. At the time, I chalked it up to the cold morning air. About 3 hours into my hike, I started getting this weird feeling. You know when you can tell someone's watching you? That prickly sensation on the back of your neck? It was like that, but stronger. I kept stopping to look around, but couldn't see anything out of place. Just endless Douglas firs and western red cedars stretching up into the misty morning air. Then the smell hit me. If you've ever driven past a landfill on a hot day, mix that with wet dog and something else I can't even describe. It was so strong it made my eyes water. I've been around bears before. This was different. This smell had a distinctive muskiness to it that I'd never encountered in all my years of hiking. I remember checking my GPS, I was about 6 miles from my truck, elevation around 3,200 feet. That's when I heard the first tree knock. It wasn't like the sound of a falling branch or a woodpecker. This was deliberate, like someone taking a baseball bat to a tree trunk. Knock, then silence. About 30 seconds later, another knock from a different direction, maybe 100 yards to my left. My heart started racing. I reached for my camera phone, hands shaking slightly. That's when I noticed how dead silent the forest had become. No birds, no squirrels, nothing. Just that oppressive silence you get before a major storm. I started hearing heavy footsteps in the underbrush, moving parallel to the trail I was on. Whatever it was big, and it wasn't trying to be quiet anymore. The footsteps were slow, deliberate, bipedal, not a bear, not an elk. The pattern was unmistakably human-like, but the weight behind each step made the ground vibrate slightly. I'm 6'2", and what happened next made me feel like a child. About 50 yards ahead, something massive stepped onto the trail. My brain couldn't process what I was seeing at first. It was at least 8 feet tall, covered in dark brown, almost black hair. The muscle mass on its shoulders and arms was incredible, like a gorilla on steroids. But it stood upright, completely bipedal, in a way that was disturbingly human. I froze. Complete deer in headlights freeze. The creature turned its head toward me and I saw its face. That's what haunts me the most. It wasn't animal-like at all. It had this intelligence in its eyes that I can't explain. Deep-set eyes under a prominent brow ridge, wide nose, but the expression, there was something there, something aware. We stared at each other for what felt like minutes but was probably only seconds. Then it made this sound, not a roar or a growl, but this deep, resonant vocalization that I felt in my chest. It was like nothing I'd ever heard before. The closest I can compare it to is whale song, but deeper, more complex. That's when I noticed my nose was bleeding. Not heavily, just a few drops, but I hadn't bumped it or done anything to cause it. The creature saw this and did something I still can't explain. It raised its right hand, palm forward, like a person would do to say stop. Then it turned and walked into the forest, each step deliberate and powerful. I stood there for maybe 5 minutes, afraid to move. When I finally got my wits about me, I took out my phone to document anything I could. The ground where it had stood showed clear impressions. 16 inches long, humanoid but massive, with 5 distinct toes. I took pictures, but they came out blurry and distorted, like there was something wrong with my camera. I made it back to my truck in record time, looking over my shoulder the whole way. I told myself I'd keep this experience to myself. Who would believe me anyway? But then last week, everything changed. I received a letter in my mailbox. No return address, no postmark. Inside was a single piece of paper with these words: "You have been chosen. The mark is proof. Return to where it began." Below the text was a symbol I'd never seen before, something like a spiral with 5 lines radiating from it. Here's the thing that made my blood run cold. I had that exact same symbol on my forearm. It appeared as a birthmark-like marking about a week after my encounter. I'd been to 2 dermatologists about it, and neither could explain it. They said it looked like a birthmark I'd had all my life, but I know it wasn't there before. Against my better judgment, I went back to the trail yesterday. This time, something was different. About a mile in, I saw someone standing on the trail, a man, tall and thin, wearing what looked like hiking gear. As I got closer, I realized something was off about him. His movements were too fluid, too precise. When he turned to look at me, his eyes, they had that same intelligence I'd seen in the creature. He spoke, but his mouth didn't match his words, like watching a badly dubbed movie. "You bear the mark," he said. "Few are chosen. Fewer understand. They protect those who are marked. Watch. Wait. You will understand when the time comes." Before I could respond, there was that familiar tree knock in the distance. The man, or whatever he was, tilted his head slightly, then walked into the forest. Just like that, he was gone. As I stood there trying to process what had happened, I heard that deep vocalization again, but this time it felt different, almost like a greeting. I don't know what any of this means. The mark on my arm seems to pulse sometimes, especially when I'm in the forest. I've tried researching similar experiences, but nothing quite matches what I've encountered. I'm not crazy. I know what I saw, what I experienced, but I can't shake the feeling that this isn't over. Something's happening, something bigger than just random Bigfoot sightings. The strangest part? I'm not afraid anymore. When I'm in the forest now, I feel protected, like I'm part of something I don't understand yet. I've never believed in the supernatural or any of that stuff, but after what I've experienced, I don't know what to believe anymore. I'm sharing this now because I need to know if anyone else has experienced anything similar. Has anyone else been marked, seen the thin man, received a letter? I keep the letter locked in my desk drawer, and sometimes late at night I swear I can hear that deep, resonant sound in the distance, even though I live miles from the forest. I'll update if anything else happens, but right now, I'm just trying to make sense of it all. One thing's for certain, whatever's out there, it's more intelligent and organized than anyone has ever imagined. And for some reason I can't fathom, it chose me. Story 5. It was July 15th, 2023. I'd done the Lake Crescent trail dozens of times before, usually during the day. But that evening I decided to try a night hike. The weather forecast showed clear skies, and I wanted to photograph the stars reflecting off the lake. I've been hiking for over 15 years and always considered myself pretty level-headed about wilderness safety. I had my gear sorted, headlamp, backup flashlight, emergency kit, bear spray, the works. I even left my trip details with my roommate's standard procedure for solo hiking. I parked at the Storm King Ranger Station around 9:30 p.m. The temperature was perfect, around 62 degrees Fahrenheit, with barely any wind. The quarter moon provided just enough natural light to create that ethereal twilight atmosphere that makes night hiking so special. I remember checking my watch and thinking how the conditions couldn't have been better. The first mile was completely normal. I saw a couple of deer, heard the usual owl calls, nothing unusual. But around 10:15 p.m., about 2 miles into the trail, things started feeling off. You know that feeling when you're alone but suddenly feel like you're being watched? It was like that, but amplified by 1,000. The forest had gone completely silent, not gradually but all at once. No crickets, no rustling leaves, nothing, just dead silence. I stopped walking and turned off my headlamp to listen better. That's when I first noticed the smell. Everyone talks about the smell when they describe Bigfoot encounters, but nothing could have prepared me for it. It wasn't just bad, it was wrong. Like a mix of wet dog, rotting meat, and something else I can't even describe. It made my eyes water and triggered an instinctive gag reflex. Then I heard it, a sound that still haunts my dreams. About 50 yards behind me, a branch snapped. Not like when a deer steps on a twig, but like someone had taken a baseball bat to a tree branch. The crack echoed through the silent forest, and I felt it in my chest. I switched my headlamp back on and slowly turned around, my heart pounding so hard I could hear my pulse in my ears. Nothing, just darkness beyond my light's beam. I stood completely still, trying to control my breathing, which suddenly seemed impossibly loud. That's when I saw movement in my peripheral vision, something massive shifting behind a cluster of trees about 40 yards away. Whatever it was huge, way too big to be a bear, and it was moving upright. I'm 6'2", and this thing had to be at least 8 feet tall. The way it moved was intelligent, deliberate. It wasn't just wandering around, it was positioning itself. I could see its silhouette moving from tree to tree, always staying just at the edge of my light's range. The worst part was that I could hear it breathing, deep, heavy breaths that sounded almost human, but not quite. My first instinct was to run, but everything I'd ever learned about wilderness survival screamed that running was the worst thing I could do. So I started walking backward, keeping my light pointed in the direction of the movement. That's when it let out a sound that I'll never forget. A cross between a roar and a scream that seemed to come from everywhere at once. It was so loud it physically hurt my ears and sent vibrations through my chest. The thing stepped into partial view, and I got my first clear look at it. The body was massive, covered in dark, matted fur that looked almost black in my light. But it was the face that turned my blood to ice. The eyes caught my light and reflected back a deep red color, like a predator's eyes but larger. They were set deep in a face that was simultaneously ape-like and disturbingly human. The brow ridge was prominent, and the jaw was massive, but there was an intelligence in those eyes that made it far more terrifying than any animal. That's when it started playing with me. There's no other way to describe it. It would disappear into the darkness. Then I'd hear it crashing through the undergrowth to my left, then suddenly it would be on my right. It was herding me, forcing me off the trail and deeper into the forest. Every time I tried to turn back toward the trail, it would let out another one of those horrifying screams and crash through the trees closer to me. I was full on panicking now, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I stumbled over roots and rocks, barely keeping my footing. The thing was getting closer. I could hear its footsteps, heavy thuds that seemed to shake the ground. The smell was overwhelming now, making me dizzy. Then I tripped. My foot caught on something and I went down hard, losing my grip on my flashlight. It rolled away, the beam spinning crazily through the trees. As I scrambled to get up, I heard it approaching, fast, heavy footsteps coming straight at me. In desperation, I grabbed my bear spray and discharged it in a wide arc behind me, not even sure if I was aiming in the right direction. I heard a deep, almost human-like grunt of surprise, followed by heavy coughing. Taking advantage of the moment, I ran. I ran harder than I've ever run in my life, crashing through branches and undergrowth, not caring about the direction. My lungs were burning, and branches were whipping across my face, but pure adrenaline kept me going. I could hear it pursuing me, but it seemed to be staying behind, almost like it was just keeping pace. The footsteps would get closer, then fall back, closer, then fall back, like it was toying with me. This went on for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes. Finally, I broke through some bushes and found myself back on the main trail. I could see my car's reflection in the moonlight about a quarter-mile away. That's when I heard one final scream, but this time it was distant, back in the forest, like it was letting me go. I made it to my car and drove straight home, my hands shaking so badly I could barely hold the steering wheel. The entire drive I kept checking my mirrors, half expecting to see that massive shape emerge from the darkness behind me. When I got home, I discovered deep scratches all over my back from branches, and my clothes were torn in several places. But what really shook me was finding a clump of coarse, dark hair tangled in my jacket zipper. I still have it, sealed in a plastic bag, but I'm honestly too scared to take it anywhere for testing. Part of me doesn't want to know. It's been 3 months and I still haven't gone hiking again. I've tried to rationalize what happened. Stress, exhaustion, bears, anything. But I know what I saw. Those eyes, that intelligence, the way it moved. There was nothing natural about it. Every night, I relive those moments in my dreams, and every time I wake up, I can still smell that awful, distinctive odor. I've read other people's encounters with Bigfoot, but nothing prepared me for the reality. It wasn't just some large, hairy creature in the woods. It was intelligent, calculating, and seemed to enjoy terrorizing me. That's what keeps me up at night. Not just that these things exist, but that they're smart enough to stay hidden, smart enough to play with their prey, and smart enough to let you live to tell about it. I don't expect everyone to believe me. Before this happened, I probably wouldn't have believed it myself. But I know what I experienced that night was real. Something is out there in Olympic National Park, something that shouldn't exist but does. And the worst part is knowing that it's still out there, probably watching other hikers, deciding whether or not to make itself known. I'm sharing this as a warning. If you're hiking in Olympic National Park, especially at night, and the forest goes silent, get out. Don't wait. Don't try to investigate. Just get out. Because if you're lucky enough to survive an encounter like mine, you'll never be the same. Story 6. I've been sitting on this story for almost 2 years now, trying to make sense of what happened that day in the Hoh rainforest. I've never been much of a believer in cryptids or anything supernatural, but what I experienced that afternoon in Olympic National Park has completely changed my perspective on reality. I'm still shaken when I think about it, and I haven't been able to go hiking since. Most importantly, I haven't seen or heard from my friend Mark since that day, and the authorities have no leads on his disappearance. It happened on October 12th, 2022. Mark and I had planned this hike for weeks. We're both experienced hikers and had done several trails in Olympic National Park before, but we'd never ventured deep into the Hoh rainforest. The weather that morning was typical for the Olympic Peninsula, overcast with a light drizzle, temperature around 45 degrees Fahrenheit. We arrived at the visitor center parking lot around 7:30 a.m., planning to do the Hoh River Trail with some off-trail exploration. We signed in at the trailhead registry, and started our hike around 8 a.m. The first couple of hours were absolutely normal. We saw a few other hikers, took some pictures of the massive Sitka spruces draped in moss, and spotted some Roosevelt elk in the distance. We had planned to hike about 10 miles in, set up camp, and then head back the next day. The first strange thing I noticed was around 11:30 a.m., about 8 miles into the trail. The forest had gotten eerily quiet. If you've ever been in the Hoh rainforest, you know it's usually filled with bird calls, the rustle of small animals, and the constant sound of water dripping from the canopy. But suddenly, all of that just stopped. Mark noticed it too. We both just kind of looked at each other without saying anything. That's when we caught the first whiff of that smell. I've been in the woods my whole life and I've never smelled anything like it. It was this intense, musty odor, like wet dog mixed with rotting vegetation and something else I can't even describe. It was so strong it made my eyes water. We decided to take a break and have some lunch, thinking maybe we were just getting tired and paranoid. We found a fallen log about 50 feet off the trail and sat down to eat our sandwiches. That's when we heard the first wood knock, a sharp, deliberate sound that echoed through the forest. It came from somewhere behind us, maybe 200 yards away. Mark suggested it was probably a woodpecker, but we both knew woodpeckers don't make sounds that loud or sharp. As we were packing up our lunch, we heard another knock, this time from our right, closer to the river, then another from our left. 3 distinct knocking sounds, forming a triangle around us. My heart started racing. These weren't random forest sounds, they were clearly coordinated. Mark wanted to press on, saying we were probably just psyching ourselves out. But something felt very, very wrong. We decided to head back to the trail, but as we started walking, we heard movement in the underbrush. Not just from one direction, but from multiple points around us. Something was paralleling our movement. That's when I saw it. Through a gap in the trees, about 100 yards away, a massive dark figure moved behind a Sitka spruce. It had to be at least 8 feet tall, covered in dark brown or black hair. The way it moved was wrong, too fluid for something that size, too quiet. I grabbed Mark's arm and pointed, but it was already gone. He started to say something about bears, but we both knew bears don't move like that. We picked up our pace, trying to stay quiet while moving quickly back toward the trail. That's when we heard the vocalizations. It started as a low, rumbling growl that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. Then another joined in from a different direction, then another. They weren't quite howls, weren't quite growls, something in between that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. I've heard wolves, bears, cougars. This was nothing like any of those. We were about 30 feet from the main trail when Mark stopped suddenly. "Did you see that?" he whispered, pointing to our left. I followed his gaze and saw movement, something massive stepping behind a tree about 75 yards away. Then more movement to our right. We were being surrounded. I pulled out my phone to try to record what was happening, but my hands were shaking so badly I could barely hold it. The screen showed no service, not surprising that deep in the forest. Mark had his phone out too, trying to get a photo, when we heard a crash behind us. What happened next still haunts me. Mark turned to look at the sound, and I took 2 steps toward the trail. When I turned back, maybe 3 seconds later, Mark was gone. Just gone. No sound, no struggle, nothing. 1 second he was there, the next he had vanished. I called out his name in a panic, forgetting all about trying to stay quiet. My voice echoed through the trees, but there was no response. The forest had gone completely silent again, except for those low, rumbling sounds that seemed to be getting closer. I ran. I'm not proud of it, but pure survival instinct took over. I sprinted for the trail, my backpack bouncing wildly. As I ran, I could hear movement on both sides of me, heavy footsteps keeping pace with me through the forest. They weren't even trying to be quiet anymore. The footsteps were coordinated, working together to herd me in a specific direction. I broke through onto the main trail and ran full speed downhill toward the trailhead. The whole time I could hear them moving through the forest on both sides of the trail. There had to be at least 4 or 5 of them. Every few hundred yards, one would crack a branch or knock on a tree, letting me know they were still there. About 2 miles from the trailhead, the sounds started to fade. By the time I reached the visitor center parking lot, my legs were rubber and I could barely breathe. I burst into the ranger station, probably looking like a complete madman, and tried to explain what had happened. The search for Mark lasted 2 weeks. They found our lunch spot and some of our footprints, but no sign of Mark or what had taken him. The official report lists him as a missing person, probably lost in the wilderness or victim of a possible animal attack. But they never found any blood, any torn clothing, any sign of a struggle. He just vanished. I've spent countless hours since then researching similar incidents in the Olympic Peninsula. I've found other reports of coordinated wood knocks, of hikers being herded by unseen creatures, of that same terrible smell, but nothing that explains what happened to Mark. The rangers and police probably think I'm crazy, or that I had something to do with Mark's disappearance. Sometimes I wonder if I am crazy. But I know what I saw, what I heard, what I smelled. There's something out there in the Hoh rainforest. Not just one creature, but many of them. And they're intelligent. They work together. They communicate. They plan. I still have nightmares about those footsteps paralleling me through the forest, about that moment when Mark vanished. I've tried to go back to normal life, but I can't shake the feeling that I glimpsed something that wasn't supposed to be seen. Something that's been living in those ancient forests for who knows how long, staying hidden, watching, waiting. The worst part? I can't shake the feeling that they let me go, that they could have taken me too, but they chose to herd me out instead, like they were sending a message. Sometimes, when I'm lying awake at night, I wonder, what happened to Mark? Is he still out there somewhere? And will they eventually come for me too? I've never posted about this before, but I had to get it off my chest. I know how it sounds. Believe me, I do. If someone had told me this story 2 years ago, I would have thought they were making it up or had gotten spooked by shadows and normal forest sounds. But I know what I experienced. And I know that somewhere in the Hoh rainforest, something intelligent and organized is watching and waiting for its next encounter with an unsuspecting hiker. Story 7. It was October 15th, 2023, around 4:30 p.m. I remember the time exactly because I kept checking my phone, worried about losing daylight. The sun sets early in Seattle during fall, and I was already regretting my decision to go for a late afternoon hike in Discovery Park. The weather was typical for Seattle in autumn, overcast, misty, with that heavy dampness in the air that seems to muffle all sound. I've hiked Discovery Park hundreds of times. It's huge, over 500 acres of urban wilderness right in Seattle. I know every trail, every viewpoint, and I've never felt unsafe there, until that day. The first sign that something was wrong came when I was on the loop trail, heading towards South Beach. The usual background noise of the park, birds, distant traffic, other hikers, just stopped. It wasn't gradual. It was like someone had hit a mute button. The silence was so sudden and complete that my ears started ringing. Then came the smell. If you've ever caught a whiff of something dead and rotting, multiply that by 10 and add this weird, musky undertone. It was so strong I actually gagged. I've read other accounts of Bigfoot encounters describing a similar smell, but I never believed them until that moment. I heard branches snapping behind me, not the light cracking sound of a squirrel or even a deer, but heavy breaks that sounded like someone was snapping baseball bats in half. My whole body froze. Whatever was making those sounds was big, and it was getting closer. That's when I saw it. About 50 yards away, partially hidden behind a massive Douglas fir, was this thing. It was huge. I'm 6'2", and this creature would have towered over me by at least 2 feet. Its body was massive, covered in dark brown, almost black hair. But what really got me were its eyes. They weren't animal eyes. There was intelligence there, and something else I still can't explain. I didn't stick around to get a better look. I ran. I'm not proud of it, but every instinct in my body was screaming at me to get out of there. I could hear it moving through the forest behind me, keeping pace without much effort. It wasn't just chasing me. It was herding me, forcing me to take specific paths. I tried calling Emily, who I knew was also in the park that day, taking photos for her wildlife blog. My hands were shaking so bad I could barely hold my phone. When she finally answered, her voice was trembling. "Matt, "There's something following me," she whispered. "I'm near the old military buildings. I need help." The old military buildings, World War II, era structures that are mostly abandoned now. I knew exactly where she was, and I realized with growing horror that I was being pushed in that exact direction. The thing behind me was joined by another one. I could hear them moving in parallel through the woods, flanking me. They were coordinating, working together. This wasn't random animal behavior. They wanted us in those buildings. I found Emily hiding in one of the old battery installations, concrete bunkers built into the hillside. She was pale, clutching her camera like a lifeline. "There are 3 of them," she managed to say. "They've been following me for the past hour." We were trapped. The only way out was through the main entrance, and we could hear them moving around outside. The light was fading fast, and the temperature was dropping. Our phones showed no signal, typical for that part of the park, but now it felt deliberate. What happened next still doesn't make sense. One of them appeared in the doorway, a massive silhouette that blocked out what little light was left. It just stood there, watching us. Then it made this sound, not a growl or a roar, but almost like speech. A series of deep guttural vocalizations that had a clear pattern to them. The others responded from outside with similar sounds. They were communicating, and somehow I knew they were talking about us. Emily's camera had died mysteriously, even though she'd charged it fully that morning. My phone was dead too, despite having 80% battery when I'd called her. The creature in the doorway took one step forward, and I swear it reached out toward us with what looked like a hand, not a paw, but an actual hand with opposable thumbs. Then, just as suddenly as they'd appeared, they left. We could hear them moving away through the underbrush, their heavy footsteps fading into the distance. We waited nearly 2 hours before we dared to leave. The park was completely dark by then, but somehow we made it back to the parking lot. Our phones started working again the moment we got to our cars. Here's the thing that really gets me. We found marks on our arms the next day. 3 small dots arranged in a triangle, like something had marked us. Emily has the exact same marks, in the exact same place on her left forearm. They faded after a few days, but sometimes they still itch, especially when we're near the park. I've gone over this hundreds of times in my head, trying to make sense of it. These weren't just animals. The way they coordinated, the way they herded us specifically to that location, the strange marks. It all suggests something far more intelligent and purposeful than a random encounter. Why us? Why that specific day? Why did they let us go? I've been researching similar encounters, and I've found a few reports from Discovery Park over the years that match parts of our experience, the smell, the coordinated movement, the vocalizations, but none mention being marked. Emily and I have only told a few close friends about this. Who would believe us? But we know what we saw, what we experienced. Something chose us that day, and I can't shake the feeling that it's not over. I still hike, but never alone and never in Discovery Park. Sometimes, when I'm in the woods, I get this overwhelming sensation of being watched, like they're still out there, waiting. The marks on our arms may have faded, but the memory of that day hasn't. I don't know what those creatures were, but they weren't simple animals. They had a purpose, an intelligence, and for some reason, they chose us. I just wish I knew why. Last week, Emily called me in the middle of the night. She'd been having dreams, vivid ones, about being back in that bunker. In her dreams, the creatures are trying to tell her something. She started keeping a journal of these dreams, and some of the patterns she's noticed are disturbing. But that's another story entirely. I'm sharing this now because I need to know if anyone else has experienced something similar. The coordinated behavior, the marks, the dreams that followed. It can't just be us. There has to be a reason they singled us out, and I can't help feeling that this is all building up to something bigger. If you've had a similar experience, especially in Discovery Park or the surrounding areas, please reach out. We need to understand what's happening, because deep down, I know they're still out there, and they're not done with us yet. Story 8. I've lived in my cabin near Lake Crescent, Washington for about 3 years now. It's on the northern edge of Olympic National Park, pretty isolated, about 15 miles from Port Angeles. I moved here after my divorce, wanting some peace and quiet. The cabin sits about 200 yards from the lake's edge, surrounded by dense forest. The nearest neighbor is about 2 miles away. It was October 12th when everything started. The weather had turned cold early this year, with heavy fog rolling in from the lake most mornings. That morning started like any other. I was having coffee on my porch around 6:30 a.m., watching the mist drift between the trees. The first thing that struck me as odd was the silence. Usually there's a constant background noise of birds, squirrels, and other wildlife. But that morning, everything was dead quiet. At first I thought maybe it was just the weather, but then I noticed my dog, Rex, acting strange. He's usually pretty chill, but he was standing at the edge of the porch, completely rigid, staring into the trees. His hackles were raised, and he was making this low, growling sound I'd never heard before. When I called him, he wouldn't move. That's when I caught the smell. Anyone who's spent time in the woods knows the usual forest smells: pine, damp earth, occasionally rotting vegetation. This was different. It was this overwhelming, putrid odor, like rancid meat mixed with wet garbage that had been sitting in the sun for weeks. It was so strong it made my eyes water. I went inside, chalking it up to maybe a dead animal nearby. But throughout the day, weird things kept happening. I work from home as a software developer, and around 11 a.m., I heard what sounded like something heavy walking around the side of my cabin. The footsteps were slow, deliberate. When I looked out the window, I saw nothing, but the branches of a nearby pine tree were swaying, even though there wasn't any wind. By afternoon, I was definitely on edge. Rex refused to go outside for his usual bathroom break. He just sat by the front door whining. I had to practically drag him out, and as soon as he did his business, he bolted back inside. That's when I noticed the broken branches. Not just small ones, but thick branches, snapped clean off about 8 feet up on several trees near my cabin. Some were as thick as my arm. Whatever did this had to be incredibly strong. Around 4 p.m., I was on a video call with my team when I heard it. 3 distinct knocks on the side of my cabin, like someone hitting the wall with a baseball bat. Boom, boom, boom. My co-workers saw me freeze on camera. When they asked what was wrong, I made up some excuse about bad internet and ended the call. I grabbed my hunting rifle, I keep it for emergencies, and did a quick walk around the cabin. That's when I found the tracks. They were like nothing I'd ever seen before. Enormous footprints, easily 16 inches long, pressed deep into the soft ground near my woodpile. They looked almost human-like, but way too big. The stride length between them was massive, maybe 6 feet apart. As dusk approached, things got worse. The knocking started again, but this time from different sides of the cabin, like whatever it was circling the house. Then came the vocalizations. I've heard every animal in these woods, bears, cougars, elk, but this was different. It started as a low, guttural growl that turned into this high-pitched howl that seemed to go on forever. It was too structured to be an animal, but definitely wasn't human. I called the local police, but they just said they'd send someone to check it out in the morning. They probably thought I was some city guy spooked by normal forest sounds. I knew better. I'd lived here long enough to know what was normal and what wasn't. Around 8 p.m., the power went out. When I checked the breaker box outside with my flashlight, I found the main power cable had been completely torn out of the wall. Not chewed through by an animal, torn out, with the metal conduit bent and twisted. I retreated inside and barricaded myself in my bedroom with Rex, my rifle, and my phone. The battery was at 40%, and of course, there was barely any signal, typical for this area. That's when the true terror began. Something started systematically testing the doors and windows, not just rattling them, but actually trying the handles, moving from one to the next. I could hear heavy breathing outside my bedroom window. When I shined my flashlight out there, I caught a glimpse of something that still haunts me. Through the fog, I saw a massive dark figure, at least 8 feet tall, covered in dark reddish-brown hair. It wasn't just standing there, it was watching me, studying me. The eyes reflected my flashlight beam with an orange glow, and I could see intelligence in them. This wasn't some animal acting on instinct, it was calculating its next move. The creature disappeared into the darkness, but I could hear it moving around the cabin all night. Sometimes it would go quiet for an hour, making me think it had left. Then suddenly there'd be a huge crash, as it threw something against the walls. I found out later it was throwing my firewood pile. Around 3 a.m. it started mimicking sounds. First, it was Rex's barking, coming from outside, a perfect copy that made my dog go crazy. Then, most terrifyingly, it started mimicking my voice, calling out "Rex!" just as I had earlier that day. The sound was almost perfect, but had this deep, wrong undertone to it that made my skin crawl. As dawn approached, the attacks intensified. The creature started hitting the walls harder, focusing on the bedroom area. Each impact made the whole cabin shake. I was sure it was going to break through at any moment. I had my rifle trained on the window, hands shaking, knowing that if it wanted to get in, it probably could. Then, just as suddenly as it all began, everything stopped. The first rays of sunlight were coming through the trees, and the woods came alive with normal morning sounds. Birds started chirping, and I could hear squirrels scampering on the roof. It was like flipping a switch. When I finally got the courage to go outside, the devastation around my cabin was incredible. My woodpile was scattered everywhere. There were deep scratches in the wooden walls, about 8 feet off the ground. Half the vegetables in my small garden had been pulled up and thrown around. But the most disturbing thing was the pattern of it all. This wasn't random animal destruction. The damage was methodical, like it was sending a message. I spent that day packing essential items into my truck. The police finally showed up around noon, took some pictures, and suggested it might have been bears or vandals. They clearly didn't believe me when I tried to explain what really happened. One officer even smirked when I mentioned the footprints, which had mysteriously disappeared in the morning dew. I'm writing this from a motel in Port Angeles. I've been trying to convince myself to go back to the cabin, but I know I can't. Whatever that thing was, it was marking its territory, and I was the intruder. The real estate agent is listing my cabin next week. The strangest part? I've been researching similar incidents in the area. Turns out there have been dozens of reports around Lake Crescent over the years, all describing similar experiences, some going back to the early 1900s. People talk about a territorial creature that seems to specifically target homes built in certain areas near the lake. Like it has established boundaries it won't let people cross. I've always been skeptical about Bigfoot stories. I used to think they were just tall tales or misidentified bears. But after what happened that night, I know better. Whatever's out there in those woods is intelligent, strategic, and definitely not a bear. It knew exactly what it was doing, testing my defenses, trying to get me to leave, and it succeeded. Sometimes I wake up in the middle of the night, thinking I hear those 3 knocks on the wall. Rex still won't sleep through the night, and he barks at every shadow. I don't know if I'll ever be able to live in the woods again. Some territories I've learned aren't meant to be shared with humans. Story 9. I had picked a somewhat remote spot off the Timberline Trail, about 4 miles from the nearest ranger station. It was a Thursday, and I figured there wouldn't be many people around, which, looking back, might not have been the smartest decision. The weather was perfect that day, around 75 degrees Fahrenheit with a light breeze, and I'd gotten an early start to set up camp before dark. By late afternoon, I had my site set up in a small clearing about 50 yards from a creek. I remember checking my GPS, 45°22, N, 121°45W, elevation roughly 4,800 feet. The spot was gorgeous. Old-growth Douglas firs all around, patches of wild blackberries nearby. I'd been there maybe 3 or 4 times before, always without incident. The first hint that something was off came around 6:30 p.m. I was gathering firewood when I noticed how quiet it had gotten. Anyone who spends time in the woods knows that sudden silence usually means something's wrong. The birds had stopped chirping, no more squirrels rustling in the underbrush, just dead silence. At first I chalked it up to maybe a mountain lion in the area and decided to stick closer to my camp. But then came the smell. God, that smell. It hit me like a wall. This incredibly powerful, musty odor, like rotting meat mixed with wet dog and something else I can't even describe. It was so strong it made my eyes water. I've smelled dead animals in the woods before, but this was different. This was fresh, and it seemed to be moving. I grabbed my bear spray and hunting knife, I always carry both when camping alone, and started scanning the tree line. The sun was still up, but the forest was getting darker under the canopy. That's when I heard the first tree knock, a sharp, deliberate sound about 100 yards to my left. If you've never heard one, it's unmistakable. Not like a falling branch, but like someone taking a baseball bat to a tree trunk. My hands were shaking as I tried to get my flashlight out of my backpack. Another knock came from behind me, then another from my right. Whatever this was, it was coordinated, and I was being surrounded. I'm 6'2" and pretty well built, but right then, I felt incredibly small. The first visual contact happened at 7:15 p.m. I remember checking my watch because I was trying to keep myself calm by focusing on details. Through the trees, about 80 yards away, I saw something move. At first, my brain tried to make it a bear, but bears don't stand that tall. This thing was massive. I'd estimate 8, 9 feet tall, with a bulk that made it look like an NFL linebacker ×2. Its fur was this dark reddish-brown color, matted in some places. But what really got me were its movements. Smooth, deliberate, almost human-like, but not quite. It stepped partially into a clearing, and I could see it clearly now. The proportions were all wrong for a bear. Long arms, relatively small head sitting directly on broad shoulders, no visible neck. It was watching me. Not like an animal watches you. This was different. There was intelligence there, assessment. I could feel it sizing me up. That's when the vocalization started. It wasn't a roar or a growl. It was this low, rumbling sound that seemed to come from deep in its chest, almost infrasonic. You could feel it more than hear it. My whole body was screaming at me to run, but I remembered everything I'd ever learned about predators. Running triggers their chase instinct. I started slowly backing toward my tent, trying to keep my eyes on the creature while reaching for my camera. That was my mistake. As soon as I broke eye contact to fumble with my phone, it moved. The speed was unreal. Something that size shouldn't be able to move that fast. In 3 strides, it had covered half the distance between us. I abandoned any thought of documentation and grabbed my bear spray. The creature stopped about 40 yards away, rising to its full height. That's when it let out this ungodly sound. Not quite a scream, not quite a roar, but loud enough that I felt it in my chest cavity. Birds erupted from the trees. I've never experienced anything like it. It took another step forward, and I discharged the bear spray, though the wind carried most of it away. The creature reacted, not like it was hurt, but like it was surprised. It made this barking, coughing sound and took a step back. That's when I heard movement in the underbrush behind me. There was another one. I couldn't see it clearly, but I could hear it moving through the brush, smell that same overwhelming odor. The first creature was still in front of me, and now I was caught between them. My heart was pounding so hard I could barely think. The one behind me was getting closer. I could hear branches snapping under its weight. That's when I made a decision that probably saved my life. Instead of running away from either of them, I ran perpendicular to their positions, straight toward the creek. I had to get out of their territory. I left everything, my tent, my gear, all of it. Behind me, I could hear them moving through the forest, but they weren't chasing at full speed. It was more like they were escorting me out. I ran for what felt like hours, but was probably only about 20 minutes, stumbling and slipping in the growing darkness. I only stopped when I hit the main trail, my lungs burning. The sounds of pursuit had stopped, but that smell lingered in my nostrils for hours afterward. I made it to the ranger station around 10 p.m., soaking wet and probably looking like a madman. I told them I'd been spooked by some wildlife and abandoned my camp. I couldn't bring myself to tell them what I'd really seen. Who would believe me? The next day, I went back with 2 rangers to retrieve my gear. The campsite was destroyed. My tent was torn apart, cooler smashed open, everything scattered. The rangers blamed it on bears, but I knew better. There were no claw marks on the cooler, just dents like it had been thrown against trees. And there were footprints. Massive, human-like prints in the soft earth near the creek, at least 16 inches long. The rangers saw them too, but quickly dismissed them as probably overlapping bear tracks. But what really convinced me, what keeps me up at night sometimes, is what we found on one of the trees near my camp. About 8 feet up, there were clumps of reddish-brown hair snagged in the bark. The rangers collected it in a bag, saying they'd look into it, but I never heard anything more about it. I've spent months trying to rationalize what happened that day. I've read everything I can find about Pacific Northwest wildlife, trying to find some other explanation. But I know what I saw. Those weren't bears. The intelligence in those eyes, the coordination of their movements, the obvious strategy they used to get me out of their territory. It was all too purposeful. I still go camping, but never alone anymore, and never in that part of Mount Hood. Sometimes when I'm in the woods and it gets too quiet, I catch myself scanning the trees, looking for movement. That day changed something fundamental in me. The Pacific Northwest forests aren't just wilderness. They're somebody else's territory, and we're just visitors who sometimes overstay our welcome. I don't expect everyone to believe this story. Hell, sometimes I wake up and have trouble believing it myself. But I know what I experienced. Those creatures aren't just legends or campfire stories. They're out there, and they're far more intelligent and organized than most people imagine. I just hope I never get close enough to confirm that again. Story 10. It started with 3 anonymous letters I received over the course of 2 weeks in July 2023. Each one was handwritten, no return address, just my name and address in neat block letters. The first 2 were brief, warning me to stay away from Timothy Lake, and they know you're watching. I almost threw them away, thinking they were some kind of prank. The third one was different. It had detailed information about my camping trips to Timothy Lake over the past 5 years. Specific dates, locations, even what equipment I'd brought. That got my attention. I'm an avid outdoorsman and wildlife photographer. I've spent countless weekends at Timothy Lake, usually in the less crowded northern shore areas. The lake's always had strange stories surrounding it, missing hikers, unexplained sounds, weird tracks. I'd dismissed them as typical backwoods legends. Now I wonder if I should have paid more attention. Against my better judgment, and definitely against what those letters warned, I decided to go back. I had to know who was sending them and why they seemed so concerned about my presence there. I packed my usual gear, Canon EOS R5 with a telephoto lens, camping equipment, and some extra batteries. I also brought my thermal imaging monocular, something I'd recently invested in for nighttime wildlife photography. I arrived at the lake around 2 p.m. on August 12th. The weather was clear, around 75 degrees Fahrenheit, with a light breeze, perfect conditions for setting up camp. I chose a spot about half a mile from the nearest designated campground, in a clearing that gave me a good view of both the lake and the surrounding forest. The area was surprisingly quiet for a summer afternoon. No boats on the water, no distant voices from other campers, just the occasional bird call and wind in the trees. The first signs that something was off came around sunset. I was setting up my camera equipment when I noticed the forest had gone completely silent. Anyone who spends time outdoors knows that sudden silence usually means something's wrong. The hair on the back of my neck stood up, and I had that unmistakable feeling of being watched. That's when I caught the smell, like wet dog mixed with rotting vegetation, but much stronger than anything I'd encountered before. It came in waves, stronger when the wind shifted from the northwest. I grabbed my thermal monocular and started scanning the tree line. What I saw next still makes my hands shake when I think about it. About 150 yards away, partially hidden behind a massive Douglas fir, was a heat signature unlike anything I'd ever seen. It was huge, I'd estimate 8-9 feet tall, and clearly bipedal. But here's where it gets even stranger. It wasn't alone. As I kept watching, I could make out more figures moving through the trees. 3, then 5, then at least 7 distinct heat signatures, all similar in size and shape. They were moving in what appeared to be a coordinated pattern, almost like they were establishing a perimeter around my camp. I'm not ashamed to admit I was terrified. My hands were trembling so badly I could barely hold the monocular steady, but I forced myself to keep watching, to document what I was seeing. The creatures seemed to be communicating with each other through a series of low whoops and knocks on trees. It wasn't random. There was a clear pattern to it, almost like a language. One figure, noticeably larger than the others, I'd estimate close to 10 feet tall, seemed to be directing the others. The others would pause their movements when it made specific sounds, then change direction or speed based on what appeared to be commands. This wasn't just a group of animals. This was organized behavior. Around 8:30 p.m., as the last light was fading, I witnessed something that challenged everything I thought I knew about these creatures. The larger one made a series of complex vocalizations, and two of the others disappeared into the forest. They returned about 10 minutes later carrying what looked like large branches. At first, I thought they were gathering firewood, but then I watched in amazement as they began weaving the branches together, creating what appeared to be some kind of temporary shelter or blind. The precision of their movements, the clear hierarchy in their group, the way they used tools, this wasn't the behavior of simple animals. These creatures were displaying problem-solving abilities and social organization that suggested a level of intelligence far beyond what any known North American wildlife should possess. As night fell completely, their activity increased. Through the thermal scope, I could see them moving in and out of my visual range, always maintaining that loose perimeter around my camp. The knocking sounds continued, but now they were joined by low, rumbling vocalizations that I could feel in my chest more than hear. Around 11 p.m., something happened that nearly made me bolt from my camp right then and there. One of the creatures approached closer than any had before, maybe 75 yards from my position. In the thermal scope, I could make out distinct features. A massive head set directly on broad shoulders, long arms that hung below its knees, and what appeared to be some kind of crude garment or covering around its midsection. It stood there, perfectly still, for almost 5 minutes. Then it raised one arm and pointed directly at my camera equipment. Shortly after, 3 quick knocks came from behind my position, followed by a series of whoops from my left and right. They were coordinating something, and I was at the center of it. I'd love to say I stayed calm and continued observing, but the truth is, I started packing up my gear as quietly as possible. The feeling of being surrounded by these creatures, watching them display intelligence and coordination I couldn't begin to understand. It was overwhelming. Just as I was stuffing my thermal scope into its case, a massive crash came from the tree line to my right, followed by heavy footsteps approaching my position. I grabbed what I could carry and ran. I didn't even bother breaking down my tent properly. Just grabbed my backpack, camera bag, and car keys. As I sprinted back toward the parking area, I could hear movement in the forest on either side of me, keeping pace with me but never quite revealing themselves. The strangest part? When I reached my car, everything went quiet. No footsteps, no knocks, no whoops, just absolute silence. Looking back with my flashlight, I could see nothing moving in the darkness. It was as if they'd just let me go. I returned the next morning with 2 local rangers to retrieve my abandoned equipment. The tent was still there, undisturbed. But all around the campsite, we found evidence I wasn't imagining things. Massive footprints, some measuring 17 inches long, broken branches far too high for a person to reach, and complex patterns of twisted vegetation that the rangers said they'd never seen before. The most unsettling discovery was what we found where I'd seen them building the shelter. The branches were gone, but the ground showed clear signs of recent activity, and there, arranged in what couldn't be random chance, were 3 stones placed in a perfect triangle, each exactly 6 feet from the others. I've spent months trying to make sense of what I saw that night. The coordinated movements, the tool use, the apparent hierarchy, it all points to something far more complex than the simple wild animal most people imagine when they think of Bigfoot. What I witnessed wasn't just a group of creatures, it was a society with its own form of communication, organization, and intelligence. I haven't received any more anonymous letters since that night. Sometimes I wonder if they were warnings or invitations. Either way, I haven't been back to Timothy Lake, and I don't plan to. Some mysteries, I've learned, are better left unexplored. The thermal imaging footage I managed to capture that night was corrupted somehow, just static and digital artifacts. Maybe that's for the best. But I know what I saw, and I know there's something out there in the forests around Timothy Lake that defies our understanding of what's possible. Story 11. It was October 12th, 2023, around 7:30 a.m., when I parked my truck at the Groves Prairie trailhead. The weather was unusually clear for Northern California that time of year, probably around 55 degrees Fahrenheit with a light breeze. I'd planned a day hike to explore some of the more remote areas of the forest. I've done this trail maybe a dozen times before, but always stuck to the main paths. This time, I wanted to check out some of the less traveled areas I'd spotted on my topographic maps. I packed light, just my day pack with water, some trail mix, beef jerky, my first aid kit, and my usual gear. I also brought my Nikon camera, hoping to catch some good wildlife shots. The first couple hours were completely normal. I saw some deer tracks, photographed a few interesting mushrooms, and enjoyed the solitude. The forest was alive with the usual sounds, birds calling, squirrels chittering, wind in the trees. Everything felt right. Around 10:45 a.m. I was about 4 miles in when things started feeling different. It's hard to explain, but any experienced hiker knows that feeling when something's off in the woods. The bird sounds just stopped, not gradually like when a predator's around. They just all went quiet at once. Even the wind seemed to die down. The hair on the back of my neck stood up, and I got this overwhelming feeling of being watched. I've had encounters with mountain lions before, so I immediately went into alert mode. I pulled out my bear spray and started scanning the tree line. That's when I caught this powerful, overwhelming stench. It wasn't like anything I'd ever smelled before, kind of like rotting meat mixed with wet dog and something else I can't even describe. It was so strong it made my eyes water. Then I heard it. About 50 yards behind me, a branch snapped. Not like when a deer steps on one. This sounded like someone had broken a baseball bat in half. My whole body went cold. I turned around slowly, and I swear to God what I saw still doesn't make sense. Between two massive redwoods, there was this figure. It was massive. I'm 6'2", and this thing had to be at least 8 feet tall. Its shoulders were incredibly broad, maybe twice the width of mine. The thing was covered in dark, reddish-brown hair, but it wasn't shaggy like you see in those fake Bigfoot videos. This was more like a horse's coat, thick and somewhat glossy. What really got me, though, were its movements. This wasn't some lumbering beast. It moved with purpose, with intelligence. When it realized I'd spotted it, it didn't run away. Instead, it took a deliberate step forward, moving with an agility that something that size shouldn't have. Its head was somewhat conical, and its eyes, I could see its eyes clearly. They weren't animal eyes. There was something eerily intelligent there. My instincts were screaming at me to run, but I remembered everything I'd learned about predators. Running triggers their chase instinct. So I started backing away slowly, keeping my eyes on it. That's when it did something that still gives me nightmares. It picked up a massive branch, had to be at least 6 inches thick, and snapped it in half like it was a toothpick. The sound echoed through the silent forest. I kept backing up, trying to maintain my composure, but I was shaking so bad I could barely keep my footing. The creature started walking parallel to me, always maintaining that 50-yard distance. It was herding me, I realized, pushing me in a specific direction. Away from what? I don't know, but it was clearly territorial behavior. Every few minutes it would break another branch or slam its hand against a tree trunk, making this hollow, booming sound that I could feel in my chest. It wasn't random aggression, it was communication, a warning. The intelligence behind its actions was undeniable. This went on for what felt like hours, but was probably about 45 minutes. I was so focused on the creature that I nearly walked right off a steep embankment. When I looked back after regaining my balance, the creature had moved closer, maybe 30 yards away now. I could see its muscles rippling under that hair. Its breathing was loud and deliberate. Then it made this sound that I'll never forget. Not quite a roar, not quite a scream. It was deep and resonant, but also had this almost human quality to it. It was like nothing I've ever heard in nature before. The sound practically vibrated my bones. That's when my nerve finally broke. I turned and ran. I know it was stupid, but fear took over. I could hear it moving through the forest behind me, breaking branches and making those booming sounds. The crazy thing is, it could have easily caught me. I know it could have, but it didn't. It just kept herding me, pushing me back toward the main trail. When I finally burst out onto the marked trail, the sound stopped. The presence behind me vanished, just gone, like someone had flipped a switch. A few minutes later, the birds started singing again. The forest came back to life like nothing had happened. I practically sprinted back to my truck. My hands were shaking so bad I could barely get my keys in the ignition. When I finally got home, I realized I had been so terrified I'd left my camera somewhere in the forest. There's no way I'm going back for it. I've been hiking and camping my whole life. I know every conventional explanation for what I saw: bears, mountain lions, even people in suits. But what I encountered that day wasn't any of those things. The size, the intelligence, the deliberate nature of its actions. This wasn't just some animal. This was something else. Something that's been out there a lot longer than us. The thing that really gets me, what keeps me up at night, isn't just what I saw. It's the realization that this thing knew exactly what it was doing. It wasn't just reacting to my presence. It was enforcing boundaries, protecting its territory. This wasn't a random encounter. That section of forest belonged to it, and it wanted me to know that. I haven't been back to Six Rivers since then. I still hike, but never alone, and never in that area. Sometimes when I'm lying in bed at night, I can still smell that distinctive odor, still hear that bone-chilling sound it made. I've tried to tell myself it wasn't real, that I imagined it or exaggerated it in my memory. But then I remember those eyes, that intelligence behind them, and I know what I saw was real. What's out there in Six Rivers is old, it's intelligent, and it wants to be left alone. I respect that now. Some parts of the wilderness don't belong to us, and maybe they never did. Story 12. I never thought I'd be sharing this, but what happened to me last summer in Willow Creek, California, has been eating away at me. I need to get this off my chest, even if no one believes me. I know what I saw, and more importantly, what I experienced that day in Dead Man's Hollow has completely changed my understanding of what exists in our forests. It was July 15th, 2023. I'd been in Willow Creek for about a week, staying at the Bigfoot Motel. Yeah, I know how that sounds. I'm a wildlife photographer from Oregon, and I'd come down to photograph some of the local wildlife, especially the Roosevelt elk that are common in the area. The whole Bigfoot tourism thing was just background noise to me then. Cute local folklore to sell t-shirts and coffee mugs. That morning I stopped at Thompson's General Store to stock up on supplies. It was around 7 a.m. and I was the only customer there. The owner, Bill Thompson, was restocking shelves when I walked in. He was an older guy, probably in his 60s, with that weathered look you get from spending your whole life in a small town. When he saw my camera gear, he got this strange look on his face. "Heading up into the hills?" he asked, scanning my items. His tone made me pause. There was something off about it, like he was choosing his words carefully. I mentioned I was planning to check out Dead Man's Hollow, and his hand actually froze over the register. He told me there had been 6 disappearances in that area over the past decade. Not hikers getting lost or bear attacks, people just vanishing without a trace. The way he said it, without any of the usual local color you'd expect from small-town folklore, made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. I almost wrote it off, but then he said something that stuck with me. They don't work alone, you know. That's what people don't understand. He wouldn't elaborate further, just shook his head and finished ringing me up. Despite the warning, or maybe because of it, I decided to head out to Dead Man's Hollow. It's about 8 miles northeast of town, accessible by a poorly maintained Forest Service road. I parked my Subaru at the trailhead around 9 a.m. The morning was cool and misty, typical for Northern California even in summer. The hollow itself is this deep, natural depression in the landscape, surrounded by old-growth redwoods and thick undergrowth. The first few hours were uneventful. I got some decent shots of a few elk and was tracking what I thought was a black bear through my telephoto lens. Around 1 p.m., I noticed something odd. The forest had gone completely silent. If you spend any time outdoors, you know how unnatural that is. No birds, no squirrels, nothing. Just this heavy stillness that seemed to press in from all sides. That's when I caught the smell. Everyone talks about the smell, but nothing really prepares you for it. It wasn't just your typical forest decay smell. This was different, like wet dog mixed with rotting meat and something else I can't even describe. It was so strong it made my eyes water. I heard the first knock around 1:30 p.m., a sharp crack that echoed through the hollow. It sounded like someone hitting a tree with a baseball bat, but much louder. Then another knock responded from the opposite direction, maybe 200 yards away. Then another from yet another direction. That's when I realized I was surrounded. My hands were shaking so bad I could barely hold my camera. Through my viewfinder, I caught movement to my left, something massive moving behind a cluster of redwoods about 100 yards away. Whatever it was walking upright and had to be at least 8 feet tall. Its fur was this deep reddish-brown color, almost like old rust. But what happened next is what still keeps me up at night. I heard this low, rhythmic vocalization, almost like whale song, but deeper and more guttural. Then it was answered by another call, different in pitch, but similar in pattern. They were communicating. Not just random animal noises, but actual communication. I started backing away slowly, trying to remember which direction my car was. That's when I saw the second one. It stepped out from behind a huge redwood about 50 yards to my right. This one was bigger, easily 9 feet tall, with darker fur, almost black. It moved with this incredible purpose and grace that seemed impossible for something that size. The two creatures were clearly coordinating their movements. One would move forward while the other held position. They were herding me. I realized with absolute horror that they were pushing me deeper into the hollow, away from my car. Then I heard movement behind me. A third creature, this one a lighter brown color, was approaching from the rear. They had me in a triangle. The precision of their movements, the way they worked together. This wasn't just animal behavior. This was strategy. The whale song-like calls continued, different pitches and patterns coming from all three directions. They were getting closer, maybe 30 yards away now. I could see their faces clearly through my telephoto lens. They had these deeply set eyes that reflected intelligence. Not just animal intelligence, but something that seemed to understand exactly what they were doing. In absolute panic, I did the only thing I could think of. I fired my camera's flash on full power, repeatedly. The sudden bright light seemed to startle them. The one behind me let out this incredible roar that I felt in my chest more than heard. It gave me just enough of an opening to sprint between two of them. I ran faster than I've ever run in my life. Branches whipped at my face, and I dropped most of my gear, but I didn't stop. I could hear them moving through the forest behind me, their footfalls shaking the ground. But they weren't chasing me at full speed. It was like they were escorting me out of their territory. When I finally reached my car, my hands were shaking so badly it took me 3 tries to get the key in the ignition. As I pulled away, I caught one last glimpse in my rearview mirror, 3 massive shapes standing at the tree line watching me leave. I drove straight back to Thompson's store. Bill was closing up for the day, but when he saw my face, he let me in. I told him everything. He wasn't surprised. He told me his grandfather had seen the same thing in 1943. Multiple creatures working together, using coordinated movements to herd people away from certain areas. I've spent months trying to rationalize what I saw that day. I lost my expensive camera gear in the panic, and the few photos I managed to save on my phone came out too blurry to make out anything definitive. But I know what I saw. These weren't just random animals. The way they moved, the way they communicated, the obvious intelligence behind their actions. There's something out there in those woods that we don't understand. The thing that haunts me most isn't the size of these creatures or even their coordinated hunting strategy. It's the realization that they've been there all along, living in these woods, maintaining their own society just outside our awareness. They're not just surviving out there, they're thriving, organizing and protecting their territory with an intelligence that challenges everything we think we know about what's possible. I haven't been back to Willow Creek since that day. I still do wildlife photography, but I stick to open areas now. Sometimes at night, I can still hear those deep, rhythmic calls in my dreams, and I wake up wondering what else is out there in our forests, just beyond the edge of what we're willing to believe. Story 13D. September 12th started like any other research day. I'm a wildlife biologist specializing in river ecosystems, and I'd been studying salmon populations in Northern California for the past 3 years. Frank was my local guide, a retired logger who knew every bend of the Eel River like the back of his hand. We'd worked together dozens of times before, so when he insisted we wrap up our work early that day, I knew something was wrong. It was around 4:30 p.m. when I first noticed the silence. We were about 15 miles south of Garberville, in a remote section where the river cuts through old-growth forest. The temperature was dropping faster than usual for September, hovering around 52 degrees Fahrenheit. A light drizzle had started, creating this heavy mist that clung to the redwoods. The nearest road was about 3 miles east, and the closest town was Garberville. I was taking water samples when I realized I couldn't hear any birds. In September, that stretch of river should have been noisy with autumn bird activity, but there was nothing except the sound of water and our movement. Frank noticed it too. He'd stopped arranging our gear and was standing perfectly still, his eyes scanning the tree line across the river. The smell hit us next. If you've ever driven past a roadkill that's been baking in the sun for days, mix that with wet dog and something musky, that's close to what we experienced. But it wasn't just the smell that got to me. It was how it appeared and disappeared, like something was moving around us. "We need to pack up, now." Frank's voice was barely above a whisper. I'd never heard him use that tone before. He'd always been the type to laugh off weird forest sounds or animal behavior, but this was different. His hands were shaking as he started shoving equipment into his backpack. That's when we heard the first vocalization. It came from the ridge to our west, maybe 400 yards away. It started as a low moan that built into something between a howl and a scream. I've worked around every predator in these forests, bears, mountain lions, you name it. This wasn't anything I'd heard before. Before the first call ended, another one answered from the opposite direction, closer to the river. I grabbed my camera from the waterproof case, but my hands were trembling so badly I nearly dropped it. The light was fading fast, and the mist wasn't helping. Frank grabbed my arm and pointed across the river. Through the gaps in the mist, I saw movement among the trees. Something large was walking upright, staying just inside the tree line. The vegetation there is thick, but whatever it was had to be at least 8 feet tall to be visible above the undergrowth. We started moving north along the riverbank, trying to keep our pace steady, despite every instinct screaming at us to run. Frank knew of an old logging road about a mile ahead that would lead us back to his truck. That's when we heard the splash. Something had entered the river behind us. I turned and saw a dark figure crossing the river. The water at that point was about waist deep on a human, but on this thing, it barely reached its thighs. Its movements were deliberate, powerful. The matted hair covering its body was a dark reddish-brown, almost black where it was wet. The breadth of its shoulders had to be at least twice that of a large man. Frank pulled out his revolver, a .44 Magnum he'd carried for years but never had to use. We picked up our pace, but the splashing behind us got faster too. Then we heard movement in the trees to our right. They were coordinating, trying to cut us off from the logging road. The one in the river let out another call, deeper than the others we'd heard. Almost immediately, we heard responses from at least 3 different directions. The closest one couldn't have been more than 100 yards away. That's when I noticed the largest one, what I'm assuming was the alpha, emerge from the trees ahead of us. It stood there, blocking our path, at least 9 feet tall. Its head was massive, with a pronounced sagittal crest visible even in the fading light. The face was somewhere between ape and human, with deep-set eyes that reflected a reddish color when they caught what little light was left. Frank fired a warning shot into the air. The sound was deafening in the narrow river valley. The creatures responded with a series of roars that made my knees buckle. I've never heard anything so powerful, so primal. The alpha didn't even flinch at the gunshot. Instead, it took a step toward us and beat its chest with both fists. The impact sound was like someone hitting a barrel with a sledgehammer. We were being herded. Every time we tried to move toward the forest on our right, we'd hear movement in the undergrowth. The one in the river was steadily getting closer, and the alpha stayed ahead of us, maintaining about 50 yards of distance. They were pushing us toward something. That's when Frank spotted the cave entrance partially hidden by a fallen redwood. "They're pushing us there," he whispered. "We can't let them trap us." He was right. We were about 200 yards from the cave when Frank made a decision that probably saved our lives. He fired another shot, this time into the river right next to the one pursuing us through the water. The splash must have startled it because it let out a roar and stumbled backward. In that moment of confusion, Frank grabbed my arm and we sprinted toward a steep embankment to our right. I lost my footing on the wet leaves and slid partway down, scraping my hands raw on the rocks, but Frank pulled me up. We could hear them crashing through the forest behind us, but the steep terrain seemed to slow them down. Their weight and size worked against them on the incline. We ran for what felt like hours, but was probably only about 40 minutes, stumbling through the darkness, guided only by Frank's knowledge of the terrain and the dim light of the quarter moon when it occasionally broke through the clouds. When we finally reached Frank's truck, we were both hyperventilating and soaked with sweat despite the cold. The drive back to Garberville was silent, except for our heavy breathing. Frank's hands were shaking so badly on the steering wheel that we had to pull over twice. I lost my camera during the escape, along with most of our research equipment. The only physical evidence I have is the GPS unit that was in my pocket, which shows our erratic path through the forest, and a 5-second audio recording from my phone that captured one of their calls. The recording is mostly distorted, and wildlife experts I've shared it with say it's inconclusive. Frank refused to go back to that section of the river. He sold his guide business 3 weeks later and moved to Oregon. I've spent countless hours trying to rationalize what we encountered, but there's no explaining away what we saw. The level of coordination they displayed, the clear hierarchy, the way they strategically tried to herd us. This wasn't just a group of animals acting on instinct. I've read about other encounters in the area, but none of them mention multiple creatures working together like this. Most people report seeing a single creature, maybe 2. We encountered at least 5 distinct individuals that night, working as a coordinated unit. The research station where I was based shut down our Eel River project shortly after I filed my incident report. They cited budget cuts, but I know some of my colleagues had experienced strange things in that area too. They just weren't willing to talk about it officially. I still work as a wildlife biologist, but I've transferred to a different region. Sometimes when I'm working near dense forest, I'll catch a whiff of that same musky odor, and my heart starts racing. I've installed motion-sensitive cameras around my new research sites, not for my official work, but because I need to know if they're out there too. What haunts me most isn't just what we saw that night, but the intelligence behind their actions. They weren't just trying to scare us away, they were herding us, communicating with each other, executing a strategy. There's so much we don't understand about what's living in our forests, and maybe some things we're not ready to understand. I haven't shared this story publicly until now because I know how it sounds. I'm a scientist. I'm supposed to deal in facts, evidence, and peer-reviewed research. But I also know what I saw that night on the Eel River, and I know we weren't dealing with any known species. Whatever they were organized, intelligent, and they wanted us to know we were in their territory. Story 14. I've spent the last 3 months trying to make sense of what happened to me on Highway 20 through the Cascade Range back in September. Even now, my hands shake when I type this. I know how this is going to sound, but I need to get this off my chest. On September 15th, I was driving back from a business meeting in Seattle to my home in Spokane. It was around 7:30 p.m., and I decided to take the scenic route through North Cascades National Park. I know it's longer, but after a stressful week of meetings, I wanted some quiet time to decompress. The weather was clear, but the sun was setting, casting long shadows through the dense forest on either side of the road. About an hour into the drive, I noticed something odd. The usual evening forest sounds, the birds, the rustling leaves, just stopped. It was that unnatural silence that makes the hair on the back of your neck stand up. I'd grown up camping in these mountains, and I'd never experienced anything like it. It felt wrong. I was doing about 45 miles per hour when I caught movement in my peripheral vision. Something large and dark moved through the trees to my left, keeping pace with my car. At first I thought it was just shadows playing tricks on me, but then I saw it clearly through a break in the trees, a massive dark figure running upright. It had to be at least 8 feet tall. I'm not talking about a bear. Bears don't run on 2 legs at 45 miles per hour. My heart started racing, and I pressed down on the accelerator. The speedometer hit 60, then 70. Whatever this thing was, it was still keeping pace, moving through the dense forest like it was nothing. The way it moved, it wasn't just running, it was calculating. Every time there was a break in the tree line, it would emerge briefly, as if making sure I saw it. The smell hit me next. Even with my windows up, this overwhelming stench of wet fur and something rotting seeped into my car. It was so strong it made my eyes water. I've smelled dead animals before, but this was different, more pungent, more alive. Then things got worse. The road ahead curved sharply to the right, following the mountain's contour. As I approached the bend, I saw something that made my blood run cold. There was another one, standing right at the edge of the tree line, partially illuminated by my headlights. It was massive, covered in dark brown, matted fur, but what terrifies me most, even now, was its face. It wasn't animal-like at all. There was an intelligence there, a purposefulness in its eyes that seemed to bore right through me. I slammed on the brakes, tires screeching. The creature didn't move. It just stood there, watching. Then it deliberately stepped onto the road about 50 yards ahead of me. My high beams gave me a clear view, and I wish they hadn't. Its arms hung down past its knees, ending in massive hands with visible fingers. Not paws, fingers. The proportions were all wrong for a bear or any other animal I know of. I threw the car into reverse, but immediately remembered the other one that had been following me. I was trapped between them. My hands were shaking so bad I could barely grip the steering wheel. That's when I noticed something that still haunts me. They were coordinating. The one behind me had moved to block the road in that direction too. They were herding me. The one in front took a step closer, and I noticed something else. It was holding something. In its right hand was what looked like a large branch, gripped like a club. That's when I realized with absolute certainty that this was planned. These things, whatever they were, had set this up. They weren't just reacting to my presence, they had deliberately trapped me. In pure panic, I looked at my options. To my right was a steep, uphill slope. To my left was a sharp drop-off. The creatures had left me only one choice, a narrow dirt access road I hadn't noticed before, branching off to the left between two large trees. Looking back now, I realized that's exactly what they wanted. I cranked the wheel and gunned it, my tires spitting gravel as I shot down the access road. My headlights bounced wildly as I bounced over the uneven surface. Through my rear-view mirror, I could see both creatures converging on the access road entrance. They weren't chasing me anymore. They just stood there, watching me go. The access road went on for about half a mile before opening into what looked like an old logging area. And that's where I saw it, the real reason for the whole thing. In the clearing, illuminated by my headlights, were structures. Not natural structures, but deliberately arranged branches and logs, forming what looked like crude shelters. There were dozens of them, some as tall as 15 feet, arranged in a rough circle. In the center was what looked like a massive pile of bones. I didn't stop to investigate. I threw the car into reverse again, backed out of there as fast as I could, and didn't stop until I hit the main highway. I drove the rest of the way home at 90 miles per hour with my doors locked and windows up. The thing that keeps me up at night isn't just what I saw. It's the realization that hit me later. They weren't hunting me. They were showing me something. They wanted me to see their settlement, their community. It was a deliberate display of intelligence, of organization. They could have easily attacked my car or run me off the road, but they didn't. They herded me exactly where they wanted me to go, showed me what they wanted me to see, and then let me leave. I've reported this to the park rangers, but I could tell by their faces they didn't believe me. I've gone back twice during daylight hours, trying to find that access road again. I can't find it. It's like it never existed. But I know what I saw. Those things are out there, and they're far more intelligent than anyone realizes. Sometimes at night, I still smell that distinctive odor, even though I'm hundreds of miles away now. And sometimes, when I'm driving home late from work, I catch myself checking my rearview mirror, looking for movement in the trees along the road. Because deep down, I know something else. That night wasn't a random encounter. They chose me specifically, and I still don't know why. I've never posted about this before, and I probably never will again. But I needed to tell someone who might understand. If you're driving through the Cascades, especially at night, keep your eyes on the trees. And if the forest suddenly goes quiet, don't stop. Whatever you do, don't stop. Story 15. It was October 12th, around 10:30 p.m. I was driving back to Seattle from a business meeting in Leavenworth. The weather had turned nasty, typical Pacific Northwest fall weather with a steady drizzle and patches of fog rolling through. I'd made this drive dozens of times before, so I wasn't too concerned, even though visibility wasn't great. I remember checking my gas gauge just past the Stevens Pass ski area, still had about half a tank. The traffic was practically non-existent at that hour, which wasn't unusual for a Tuesday night. I had the radio playing quietly, some late-night talk show, mostly to keep me alert on the winding mountain road. The first thing that struck me as odd was how the reception suddenly cut out around milepost 67. Just static. I didn't think much of it at first. Radio reception can be spotty in the mountains. But then my phone lost signal too. Again, not completely unusual for that area, but something felt different. The air in the car felt heavier somehow, like that feeling just before a big thunderstorm. That's when I first noticed the smell. Even with my windows up and the heater running, this overwhelming stench hit me, like rotting meat mixed with wet dog and something else I can't even describe. It was so strong it made my eyes water. I actually checked my shoes, thinking I must have stepped in something earlier. Then the wildlife started acting strange. I spotted several deer by the roadside. Nothing unusual there, but they were all facing the same direction, completely still, like statues. Their eyes weren't reflecting my headlights like they usually do. They were just staring into the forest. I slowed down, worried they might bolt across the road, but they didn't move at all, just kept staring. Around milepost 65, my car started to shudder. Not like hitting a rough patch of road. This was different. The engine was running fine, but something was making the whole vehicle vibrate. The temperature gauge was normal, but the car felt wrong. Like when you're on a boat and can feel something massive moving under the water. That's when I saw it. In my high beams, about 100 yards ahead, something huge stepped onto the road from the right side. My first thought was bear, but as I got closer, I realized this thing was walking on 2 legs. It was massive, I'm guessing at least 8 feet tall. The muscles under its dark fur were clearly visible, even in the poor lighting. But what really got me were its proportions. They were just wrong. Its arms were too long, hanging almost to its knees, and its shoulders were impossibly broad. I hit the brakes, hard. The road was wet, and I felt the ABS kick in. I stopped about 50 feet from where this thing was standing. It didn't move, just stood there, staring at me with eyes that reflected red in my headlights. Not the usual animal eye shine. This was different, deeper, more intelligent. Then it did something I still can't explain. It raised one arm and clearly, deliberately gestured for me to stop. Not like waving its arm randomly. This was a human-like stop gesture. I sat there, engine running, completely frozen. My hands were shaking on the steering wheel, and I could hear my own breathing, way too fast and shallow. The creature turned its head toward the forest on my right, and that's when I noticed the others. I'm not sure how many, maybe 3 or 4 more shapes moving in the trees. They were harder to make out, but they seemed to be carrying something big. They were moving quickly, purposefully, deeper into the forest. The one on the road kept watching them until they disappeared into the darkness. Then it turned back to me. I swear it nodded, just slightly, but definitely a nod. Then it made this sound. I've never heard anything like it. It started as a low rumble, like distant thunder, but it built into something between a roar and a scream. The sound went right through me, set off every car alarm in a mile radius if there had been any other cars around. My chest actually hurt from the vibration. After what felt like forever, but was probably only a few minutes, it stepped backward, never taking its eyes off me. When it reached the tree line, it turned and moved into the forest. The way it moved, it was too fluid, too quick for something that size. 1 second it was there, the next it had vanished into the darkness. I sat there for probably another 5 minutes, engine still running, trying to process what I'd just seen. My hands were trembling so badly I could barely hold the steering wheel. The smell lingered for a while, then gradually faded. When I finally got the courage to continue driving, I noticed the temperature had dropped significantly. There was frost forming on my windshield, even though it had been well above freezing all night. The rest of the drive home was a blur. I kept checking my mirrors, expecting to see something following me, but the road remained empty. When I got home, I noticed 3 distinct bruises on my chest, right where I'd felt that vibration from the creature's roar. I've gone back during daylight twice since then, trying to find any evidence of what happened. The first time, I found some broken branches high up, way higher than a bear could reach, and what looked like massive footprints, but the rain had mostly washed them away. The second time, about a week later, the whole area felt different. The trees seemed denser, the undergrowth thicker, like the forest was deliberately hiding something. The thing that keeps bothering me isn't just what I saw, it's what it was doing. Those others in the forest were clearly carrying something, and this thing was protecting them, standing guard, and that deliberate gesture to stop. It knew exactly what it was doing. This wasn't some animal acting on instinct. This was intelligent behavior. I've tried researching the area's history since then, found some interesting stuff about Native American legends regarding guardians of certain sacred places in those mountains. Also found reports from the 1800s about logging crews refusing to work in certain areas around Stevens Pass, claiming they were being watched by something in the forest. I haven't driven that road at night since then. I'm not sure I ever will again. Something's out there in those mountains, something that doesn't want to be discovered. Sometimes I wonder if what I saw that night was them moving something they didn't want humans to find. Whatever it was, one thing's clear. They're not just random animals wandering the forest. They're organized, intelligent, and they're protecting something. The bruises on my chest faded after about a week, but sometimes, especially on cold nights, I can still feel that vibration. And every once in a while, I catch that smell again, just for a second, even in the middle of the city. When that happens, I swear I can feel eyes watching me, like whatever I saw that night somehow knows I'm talking about this. I'm not asking anyone to believe me. Hell, I'm still trying to convince myself it was all just some weird hallucination from being too tired. But deep down, I know what I saw. And I know that whatever secrets those mountains are hiding, they have some very large, very intelligent guardians making sure they stay hidden. Story 16. I need to write this down while it's still fresh in my mind, even though my hands are still shaking. What happened to me last weekend in the Olympic Mountains has completely changed how I see the world, and I don't think I'll ever be able to go camping alone again. I'm an experienced hiker and camper, been doing solo trips in the Pacific Northwest for over 15 years. I know the Olympic Mountains pretty well, or at least I thought I did. This particular trip started on Friday, September 13th. Yeah, I know. I'd picked a remote spot near Mount Deception, about 12 miles from the nearest ranger station. The weather forecast was perfect, clear skies, temperatures in the mid-50s, typical early fall conditions. I arrived at the trailhead around 2 p.m., wanting to set up camp before sunset. The parking lot was empty, except for one truck that looked like it belonged to a ranger. The hike in was uneventful, though looking back now, I should have noticed how unusually quiet it was. No bird sounds, no squirrels, nothing. At the time, I just chalked it up to the changing seasons. I found a decent clearing about 4 miles in, nestled between some old-growth Douglas firs. It was far enough from the main trail to feel secluded, but not so far that I couldn't find my way back. I set up my tent, got my bear canister situated about 200 feet away, standard procedure here in Washington, and started gathering firewood. That's when I first felt it, that sensation of being watched. Every outdoorsman knows that feeling, but this was different. It wasn't like when you spot a deer or even a bear checking you out from the tree line. This felt calculated, intelligent. I kept scanning the woods, but the thick canopy of trees created so many shadows that it was impossible to see anything clearly. Around 6 p.m., I got my fire going and started heating up some dehydrated camping food. The sun was starting to set, and that's when the first strange thing happened. From somewhere in the forest, maybe 100 yards to my right, came this sound, like wood knocking against wood. 2 distinct knocks, then silence. I've heard woodpeckers plenty of times, but this was much deeper, much more deliberate. I was trying to convince myself it was just some natural forest sound when another knock responded from the opposite direction, followed by what I can only describe as a low whooping sound. My blood ran cold. These weren't random forest noises. This was communication. The knocking continued, moving around my campsite in a way that made it clear I was being surrounded. Sometimes it would be 2 knocks, sometimes 3, and each time there would be a response from a different direction. I counted at least 4 distinct sources of knocking. Whatever was out there, they were coordinating. The smell hit me next. This horrible, pungent odor like wet dog mixed with rotting meat and something musky I can't even describe. It was so strong it made my eyes water. I've encountered bear, elk, and pretty much every other animal in these mountains, but nothing ever smelled like this. As darkness fell, things escalated. The creatures started moving closer. I could hear heavy footsteps crushing the underbrush, branches snapping under significant weight. These weren't deer or elk movements. These were bipedal steps, slow and deliberate. I kept my fire going as bright as I could, my hunting knife on my belt and bear spray in hand. Around 9 p.m., I saw the first one. A massive dark figure, at least 8 feet tall, moved between 2 trees about 50 yards from my campfire. The firelight caught its silhouette, broad shoulders, no neck, massive arms that hung down to its knees. The thing was covered in dark, matted hair, but what really got me were its eyes. They reflected the firelight like a cat's, but they were positioned much higher off the ground than any animal I've ever encountered. That's when I realized, all those stories about Bigfoot, all those crazy encounters people report, they weren't just seeing one creature. These things hunt in groups. They're social, they're intelligent. Over the next few hours, they took turns testing my reactions. One would snap a branch to my left, and when I'd turn to look, another would throw a pine cone from the right. They were studying me, learning my behaviors. I could hear them making these low, rumbling sounds to each other, not quite growls, more like very deep, quiet speech. The most terrifying moment came around midnight. I had been sitting as close to my fire as possible, trying to keep an eye on all directions at once, when I heard something that made my heart stop. Footsteps behind me, inside my campsite, no more than 15 feet away. Whatever it was, it had managed to move that close without making a sound until that moment. I slowly turned around, and there it was. This one was even bigger than the first, probably closer to 9 feet tall. It was just standing there, watching me with these intensely intelligent eyes. Its face was almost human-like, but not quite. The brow ridge was massive, nose flat and wide, but the eyes, there was something in those eyes that spoke of intelligence, of consciousness. It tilted its head slightly, studying me, like a scientist observing a specimen. I didn't move. I couldn't move. We just stared at each other for what felt like an eternity, but was probably only 30 seconds. Then it made this soft chuffing sound, and I heard responses from at least 3 different directions in the darkness. They were talking about me, I'm sure of it. The creature took 2 steps backward, still facing me, then turned with surprising grace for something so massive and melted into the darkness. But they didn't leave. For the rest of the night, they kept up their activity around my camp. The knocking, the whooping calls, the coordinated movement. I stayed awake all night, keeping my fire as bright as possible, my back against a large tree. As the first light of dawn started to appear, the activity gradually ceased. The last thing I heard was a series of knocks moving away into the mountains, each one answered by another, farther and farther away, until they faded completely. When it was finally full daylight, I packed up my camp in record time. But before I left, I noticed something that still gives me chills. All around my campsite, just beyond the immediate clearing, I found footprints. Massive prints, 16, 18 inches long, deeply pressed into the soil. They formed a perfect circle around my camp, and the tracks showed that whatever made them had been standing still, facing inward, for long periods. They had literally been standing there, watching me, all night long. But here's the detail that really haunts me. I found small structures, cross sticks tied together with stripped bark, hanging from trees at various points around my campsite. They looked old, weathered. These things hadn't just found me by chance, they had marked this area. This was their territory, and they had probably been watching that spot, watching other campers for years. The hike back to my car was a blur. I practically ran the whole way, constantly looking over my shoulder. When I finally reached the parking lot, that ranger's truck was gone. But something was different. There was a small piece of paper under my windshield wiper. At first I thought it was a parking violation, but when I unfolded it, my blood ran cold. It was a handwritten note that just said, "They've been here longer than us. Best leave them be." I haven't been back to the Olympics since then, and I don't plan to, but I've spent countless hours researching, trying to make sense of what happened. I found similar reports, always in remote areas, always involving multiple creatures, always describing coordinated behavior. These aren't just random animals. There's a whole society up there in those mountains, hidden from our world, but far more organized and intelligent than anyone has imagined. Sometimes at night, I still hear those knocks in my dreams. 2 knocks, then 3, then 2 again. And I wake up wondering, how many other people have heard those same sounds? How long have they been watching us? And most importantly, what are they waiting for? I know how this story sounds. If someone had told me this a year ago, I would have thought they were crazy or making it up. But I know what I saw, I know what I heard, and I know that somewhere in the Olympic Mountains, they're still there, still watching, still communicating in ways we're only beginning to understand. Story 17. What happened to me in Siskiyou National Forest this past August still keeps me up at night. I'm a pretty experienced hiker, been doing solo trails throughout Oregon for about 8 years now. Nothing fancy, just weekend stuff to clear my head. But what I encountered on August 12th changed everything I thought I knew about these forests. I'd planned a day hike on the Illinois River Trail, starting early to avoid the worst of the summer heat. Left my truck at the Oak Flat trailhead around 5:30 a.m. The weather was perfect, clear skies, about 58 degrees with a light breeze. I remember checking my phone's weather app and seeing it was supposed to hit 85 later that day. Pretty standard for southern Oregon in August. The first couple hours were completely normal. I'd passed a few markers, taken some water breaks, and even spotted a couple of deer in the distance. I'm always careful about bears in this area, so I had my bear spray attached to my belt and made sure to make noise at blind turns. The trail was empty that morning, not unusual for a Wednesday, but still noteworthy. Around 8:45 a.m., something changed. I was about 4.5 miles in a section where the trail cuts through some old-growth forest. The birds just stopped. It wasn't gradual. 1 minute there was normal forest chatter, the next, dead silence. I've experienced this before when there's a predator nearby, usually a mountain lion or bear, so I immediately got my bear spray ready and started scanning the area. That's when I noticed the smell. Look, I've smelled dead animals in the woods before, but this was different. It was like rotting meat mixed with wet dog and something else I can't even describe. It was so strong it made my eyes water. My first thought was maybe there was a dead elk nearby, but this smell seemed to be everywhere and nowhere at the same time. I decided to take a quick break and check my map. That's when I heard it, a sound that still haunts me. From somewhere in the forest came this deep rumbling growl, not like a bear or a mountain lion. This was deeper, more guttural, and seemed to come from something much bigger. My whole body went cold. The hair on my arms stood up, and I felt this primal urge to run. Instead, I slowly turned around, trying to locate the source of the sound. About 60 yards away, through a gap in the trees, I saw movement. At first, I thought it was a shadow, but then it moved again. What I saw next, I'm still trying to process it. It was massive. I'm 6'1", and this thing had to be at least 8 feet tall. Its body was covered in dark, reddish-brown hair, but it wasn't uniform. Some patches were darker, almost black. The build was unlike anything I've ever seen. Incredibly broad shoulders, muscular, but with proportions that were just wrong for any known animal. Its arms were extraordinarily long, hanging almost to its knees. But what really got me were its movements. This wasn't some lumbering beast. It moved with purpose, with intelligence. It was walking on 2 legs, moving between the trees with a familiarity that suggested it knew every inch of this territory. The way it navigated the forest, it was like watching someone walk through their own home. Then it stopped. Just stopped. And it turned its head toward me. I couldn't make out its face clearly through the trees, but I could feel it looking at me. That's when the strangest thing happened. I felt this overwhelming sense of trespassing. Not fear, though I was terrified, but this deep, gut-level understanding that I was somewhere I shouldn't be. I started backing away slowly, never taking my eyes off it. That's when I noticed the trees around it. Some had these weird markings, not like bear scratches or anything I'd seen before. They were deliberate patterns, almost like symbols, carved deep into the bark. Some looked old, others seemed fresher. I realized I was standing in what felt like some kind of boundary area. The creature made this sound, not the growl from before, but something like a low, resonating hum that seemed to vibrate in my chest. Then it took one step forward, and I saw its full size in a clearing. The muscle mass was incredible. This thing could have torn a grizzly apart. Its head was somewhat conical, with a pronounced brow ridge. But what struck me most were its hands. They looked almost human-like, but larger, with visible opposable thumbs. That's when things got really weird. It raised one of those massive arms and I swear it pointed at something. I followed its gesture and noticed a pattern of broken branches leading away from the trail. They weren't randomly broken. They formed a clear path leading away from what I now believe was its territory. I took the hint. I started moving in the direction it indicated, keeping my eyes on the creature as much as possible. As I moved, I noticed more markings on trees. Some looked decades old, others much more recent. There were also these strange arrangements of stones near some of the larger trees. They weren't natural formations. Someone or something had placed them there deliberately. The creature followed me, always keeping about the same distance, making sure I stayed on this path it had shown me. I walked like this for what felt like hours, but was probably only about 45 minutes. My legs were shaking so bad I could barely walk straight. Every few minutes it would make that humming sound again, like it was communicating something. Eventually, I recognized a trail marker. I had somehow been led in a wide arc that connected back to the main trail, but much closer to the trailhead. The creature stopped at what seemed to be another boundary. It stood there watching as I made my way back to the marked trail. That humming sound came one last time, but this time it was different, almost like a warning. I made it back to my truck in record time. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely get my keys in the ignition. As I drove away, I kept checking my rearview mirror, half expecting to see it following me. It didn't. Here's what keeps me up at night. This wasn't just a random encounter with an unknown creature. Everything about it felt intentional. The markings, the stone arrangements, the way it deliberately led me out of its territory instead of attacking. This thing was intelligent. It was protecting something. Those symbols I saw carved into the trees. I've been researching similar markings reported in other areas of the Pacific Northwest. Some of them match descriptions from centuries ago. I've been back to the area twice since then, but only to the trailhead. Both times I got that same feeling of being watched, and both times I noticed that weird smell from before. I didn't go any further. Message received. I used to think these forests held no more mysteries, that everything had been discovered and documented. Now, I'm not so sure. There are things out there that we don't understand, living by rules and patterns we can't comprehend. That creature wasn't just some animal. It was a guardian of something older, something we weren't meant to disturb. I've only told this story to my wife and my closest friend, and now here. I know how it sounds. Believe me, I do. If I hadn't experienced it myself, I wouldn't believe it either. But I know what I saw. More importantly, I know what I felt. There are places in these forests that don't belong to us, and there are things out there making sure we remember that. The strangest part? Since that day, I've had this recurring dream where I see those tree markings. They seem to mean something, tell some kind of story, but I can't quite grasp it. Maybe that's for the best. Some mysteries aren't meant to be solved. Story 18. I've spent the last 3 months trying to make sense of what happened to me on the night of March 12, 2024, while driving through Humboldt County, Texas. I never believed in any of this stuff before, but what I experienced that night changed everything I thought I knew about what exists in our forests. I'm still shaking as I write this. I work as a traveling medical equipment technician, which means I often drive long distances to rural hospitals and clinics. That night, I was heading back from a service call at a small clinic in Livingston, taking the back roads through the Sam Houston National Forest because there was construction on US 59. It was around 8:45 p.m., and I was hoping to make it home to Houston before midnight. The stretch of road I was on hadn't seen much maintenance, just a narrow 2-lane blacktop with thick pine forest pressing in from both sides. My GPS had been acting weird for the last 20 minutes, kept trying to recalculate even though I knew I was on the right road. The moon was almost full, but the tree canopy was so dense that only occasional patches of moonlight made it through. The first thing that struck me as odd was how quickly the temperature dropped. My truck's external thermometer showed a 15-degree drop in just a few minutes. Then the radio started getting nothing but static, which wasn't too unusual for back roads, but something about it felt different, wrong somehow. Around 9:15 p.m., I noticed movement in my peripheral vision, something dark crossing the road maybe 200 yards ahead. I slowed down, thinking it might be a deer, but when my headlights caught it, I realized whatever it was stood at least 8 feet tall. It moved with this weird fluid grace that made my skin crawl, like something that big shouldn't be able to move that smoothly. The creature disappeared into the trees before I could get a good look, but I noticed it had dark, almost black fur that seemed to absorb the light from my headlights. I'd be lying if I said I wasn't scared, but I told myself it was just a bear walking upright or my tired mind playing tricks on me. I turned up my high beams and kept driving, but slower now, maybe 35 miles per hour instead of 55. That's when I started smelling it. This overwhelming stench like rotting meat mixed with wet dog and something else I can't even describe. It was so strong I could smell it through my closed windows and AC. About 5 minutes later I heard something hit the back of my truck. Not like a branch falling, but like something had deliberately struck it. I checked my rearview mirror and nearly drove off the road. There was another one of these things, running on 2 legs behind my truck. Even at 35 miles per hour, it was keeping pace without much effort. In the red glow of my taillights, I could see its arms were incredibly long, hanging almost to its knees, and its head seemed to sit directly on its shoulders with barely any neck. I floored it. The truck jumped forward to 60, 65, 70 miles per hour. I thought I'd left it behind, but then I heard something that still gives me nightmares, a series of deep, rhythmic whoops that seemed to come from the woods on both sides of the road. They were communicating, working together. That's when I realized I was being herded. Every time I tried to turn around, one of them would appear in the road ahead, forcing me to continue or veer off in a specific direction. I counted at least 4 different creatures, all similar in size but with slight variations in their build and fur color. Some had more reddish-brown fur, others that same light-absorbing black. The real terror set in when I noticed they were testing my reactions. One would dart out partway into the road, then retreat when I swerved or braked. Another would run alongside my truck just at the edge of my headlights, watching my response. They were learning my behavior patterns, adapting their strategy. Around 9:45 p.m., I came to a sharp bend in the road and had to slow down. That's when they made their move. 2 of them stepped out directly in front of my truck, forcing me to slam on the brakes. These ones were enormous, easily 9 feet tall, with massive shoulders and arms that looked powerful enough to flip my F-150 like a toy. Their eyes caught my headlights and reflected back this deep amber color, not like any animal I've ever seen. I was trapped. I could see more of them moving in the trees on both sides. The smell was overwhelming now, and my truck was filled with this low-frequency rumble that I could feel in my chest. That's when the strangest part happened. One of them approached my driver's side window. It moved differently than the others, more deliberately, almost human-like in its posture. It stopped about 5 feet from my door and just studied me. I've never felt more exposed or vulnerable in my life. This thing was looking at me with an intelligence that seemed impossible. Its eyes weren't animal eyes. There was something in there that understood, that was thinking and analyzing. It tilted its head slightly, and I swear it was examining my reaction to its presence. The creature raised one of its massive hands, and I noticed something that still haunts me, opposable thumbs, but longer and more developed than human thumbs. It pressed its palm against my window, and I could see these intricate dermal ridges on its fingers, like human fingerprints, but in a pattern I'd never seen before. Just when I thought they were going to tear into my truck, the one at my window made this deep, reverberating sound. Not quite a growl, more like a series of pulsed tones. Immediately, all the others backed away from my truck. The one at my window held its gaze for another few seconds, then deliberately stepped back into the tree line. I didn't wait around to see what would happen next. I gunned it the moment the road was clear. In my rearview mirror, I could see them standing at the edge of my taillight's reach, just watching me drive away. They could have easily caught up to me again, but they didn't. They'd gotten whatever they wanted from our encounter. The rest of my drive home was a blur. I kept expecting them to reappear, but they never did. When I finally pulled into my driveway in Houston, it was just past midnight. My truck had these weird marks on the back. Not scratches exactly, but these perfect parallel indentations in the metal, spaced about 4 inches apart. They're still there, but they've started to fade over time, like the metal is slowly returning to its original shape. I've gone back to that stretch of road twice since then, in broad daylight with other people. Found some unusual tracks and broken branches, but nothing that would prove what happened. The weird thing is, my GPS still can't maintain a signal in that area, and my phone loses reception in the exact same spot where I first noticed the temperature drop. I've spent countless hours researching similar encounters, trying to make sense of what I experienced. Most Bigfoot stories talk about single creatures, maybe pairs, but what I encountered that night was different. These things were working together with an intelligence that seemed almost tactical. They weren't just reacting to my presence, they were studying me, testing me, communicating with each other in ways that showed clear planning and coordination. What keeps me up at night isn't just the encounter itself, but the feeling that I was part of some kind of test or evaluation. These weren't just animals acting on instinct. They demonstrated problem-solving abilities and social coordination that suggests a level of intelligence we're not prepared to acknowledge exists in our forests. I still travel that region for work, but I never take those back roads anymore, no matter how bad the traffic is on the main highways. Sometimes when I'm driving at night, I catch myself checking my rearview mirror, half expecting to see one of those massive shapes running behind my truck. The rational part of my brain tries to explain it away, but I know what I saw. More importantly, I know what I felt. That sense of being evaluated by something that was far more intelligent than any known animal. The scariest part, I can't shake the feeling that they let me go, that whatever they were trying to learn about me, they learned it, and then deliberately chose to release me. And sometimes, on cold nights when I can't sleep, I wonder if somewhere in those woods they're analyzing what they learned, planning their next encounter, advancing their understanding of us one terrified human at a time. Story 19. September 15th started like any other shoot day. I left my truck at the Sunrise Point parking lot around 5:30 a.m. The weather was unusually clear for September, about 45 degrees Fahrenheit with minimal cloud cover. I'd been tracking some unusual wildlife movements in the Barkley Park area, about 3 miles from the visitor center. Local rangers had reported strange patterns in elk migrations, and I wanted to document it. I remember checking my gear one last time, my Canon EOS R5, 3 extra batteries, water, trail mix, and my emergency kit. I'd done this hike dozens of times, but something felt different that morning. The air felt heavier somehow, and there was this weird static feeling, like right before a thunderstorm. The first 2 hours were completely normal. I got some decent shots of the sunrise over the valley, made my way through the subalpine meadows. But around 8 a.m., I noticed something odd. The usual morning birdsong just stopped. Not gradually, like when a predator is nearby. It was like someone had hit a mute button on the entire mountain. Even the wind seemed to die down. That's when I saw the first structure. About 50 yards off the main trail, partially hidden behind a grove of mountain hemlocks. At first, I thought it was just fallen trees, but as I got closer, I realized this was deliberately constructed. Thick branches, some easily 8 inches in diameter, had been woven together in a dome-like shape, about 12 feet high. This wasn't something hikers could have made. Some of these branches would have taken enormous strength to bend and interlock like that. I've seen plenty of natural debris shelters and bear dens over the years. This was different. The construction was too precise, too intentional. And there were these markings on the trees around it, not claw marks or territory scratches like you'd see from bears. These were geometric patterns, carved about 8 feet up the trunks, 3 parallel lines crossed by 2 diagonal ones. The same pattern repeated on multiple trees, all facing the structure. My first instinct was to document everything. I started taking photos, trying to maintain a safe distance. That's when I noticed the smell. Anyone who spent time in the wilderness knows its usual scents: pine, dirt, sometimes rotting vegetation. This was different. A heavy, musky odor that made my eyes water. Not quite like anything I'd encountered before, but closest to wet dog mixed with something metallic. As I was photographing the structure, I heard it. A deep, rhythmic thumping coming from further up the mountain. It wasn't machinery. The pattern was too irregular, almost like communication. Boom, 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 then silence. A few seconds later, from a different direction, boom, boom, boom. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely hold my camera. I know I should have left right then. Everything in my body was screaming to get out of there. But I've spent my entire career documenting wildlife, and my curiosity got the better of me. I moved in the direction of the sounds, staying low and quiet. About a quarter-mile further up, in a small clearing, I found what I can only describe as a gathering place. The ground had been cleared in a perfect circle, about 30 feet in diameter. Around the perimeter were more of those geometric markings, this time made with stones pressed into the dirt. In the center was what looked like a fire pit, but not like any I've seen campers make. The stones were arranged in specific patterns, and there were these objects placed at cardinal points. They looked like bundles of sticks and bones, wrapped in bark and bound with some kind of plant fiber. The thumping had stopped, but now there was this low, rumbling sound. At first I thought it was distant thunder, but the sky was clear. It seemed to be coming from all around me, just at the edge of hearing. That's when I noticed the footprints. I've seen plenty of animal tracks in my life. These were clearly bipedal, but massive, easily 16 inches long and 8 inches wide. They were fresh, the dirt still slightly disturbed at the edges, and they were everywhere, converging on this clearing from multiple directions. I was so focused on photographing the prints that I almost missed the movement in my peripheral vision. About 50 yards away, partially hidden behind a thick stand of trees, something massive shifted. I'm not talking bear-sized. This thing had to be at least 8 feet tall. The brush was thick enough that I couldn't make out clear details, but I could see dark, matted hair and the suggestion of massive shoulders. Then another movement on the opposite side of the clearing, and another. I realized with absolute horror that I was surrounded. They were moving with an intelligence and coordination that made my blood run cold. These weren't just animals acting on instinct. This was strategic. I heard this sound then, not quite a language, but definitely communication. Deep, guttural vocalizations that seemed to have a pattern to them. One would call, another would answer from a different direction. They were coordinating, planning. I could feel them closing in. My whole body was shaking, but somehow I managed to slowly back away from the clearing. Every few steps, I'd hear movement from different directions, always just out of clear sight. They were herding me, I realized, guiding my movement away from their sacred space, but doing it in a way that let me leave. I don't remember much about my hike back to the parking lot. I kept looking over my shoulder, convinced I was being watched. The strange thing is, I probably was, but they never showed themselves clearly. They could have easily caught me if they wanted to, I'm sure of that now. Instead, they let me go. When I finally got back to my truck, my hands were shaking so badly I could barely get the key in the ignition. The first thing I did was check my camera, desperate to prove to myself that it had really happened. But every single photo, from after I found the first structure, was completely corrupted. Just black frames or weird digital artifacts. The only pictures that survived were from the early morning, before everything went wrong. I've spent months trying to make sense of what I saw that day. I've done research, reached out to experts in various fields. The few people I've told either think I'm crazy or try to explain it away as an elaborate hoax. But I know what I saw. Those structures, the markings, the coordinated movements, it all points to something far more organized and intelligent than we've ever imagined could exist out there. I haven't gone back to that specific area of Mount Rainier, though I've been tempted. Sometimes, late at night, I find myself looking at maps, tracing possible routes to that clearing. But something tells me I wouldn't find it again. Or maybe they wouldn't let me find it. What haunts me most isn't the fear I felt that day, though that was profound. It's the realization that while we've been debating the existence of these creatures, they've been out there all along, with their own society, their own means of communication, their own sacred spaces. We're not the only ones with culture and intelligence on this mountain. We're just the only ones arrogant enough to think we are. I still work as a wildlife photographer, but I'm more cautious now, more observant. Sometimes, when I'm out in the wilderness, I'll hear that distinctive thumping in the distance, or catch a whiff of that peculiar musky scent. And I know they're out there, watching, living their lives in ways we can barely comprehend. I don't need any more proof than what I experienced that day. Some secrets are meant to stay in the mountains. Story 20. I'm an amateur wildlife photographer from Aberdeen, Washington. Last fall, I was working on a personal project documenting the old-growth forests of the Olympic Peninsula. October 12th started like any other day. I packed my gear, Canon EOS R5, couple of lenses, tripod, some trail mix, water, and my usual hiking supplies. I'd gotten permission to photograph in certain areas of the reservation, and I made sure to respect all the posted boundaries and sacred sites. The morning was unusually cold for October, probably around 40 degrees Fahrenheit, with a heavy mist hanging between the massive cedars and hemlocks. I parked my truck at the Lake Crescent North Shore trailhead around 6:30 a.m., wanting to catch the morning light filtering through the fog. The air had that distinctive Pacific Northwest smell, wet earth, decaying leaves, and the sharp scent of cedar. Looking back, I should have noticed something was off from the start. The forest was dead quiet. No birds, no squirrels, nothing. At the time, I just thought it was the cold keeping the wildlife quiet. I'd been hiking for about 2 hours, following one of the marked trails, but occasionally going off path to get better angles of some particularly impressive trees. I was probably about 3 miles in when I started getting this overwhelming feeling of being watched. You know that sensation when the hair on the back of your neck stands up? It was like that, but 100 times worse. Every instinct was screaming at me to leave, but I kept trying to rationalize it. I've spent countless hours in the wilderness. I'm used to mountain lions, bears, all the usual suspects. This felt different. The first concrete sign that something was wrong was the smell. It hit me suddenly. This overwhelming, pungent odor, like wet dog mixed with rotting meat and something else I can't even describe. It was so strong it made my eyes water. I've encountered bears before, and this wasn't anything like that. I started hearing branches breaking in the distance, but not the random way animals usually move through the forest. These were deliberate. Crack, pause, crack, pause. Whatever was making those sounds was massive, and it was moving parallel to me, always keeping just out of sight in the dense undergrowth. Then I saw the trees. I'd been so focused on looking into the forest that I hadn't noticed them at first. But about 50 yards ahead, several young cedars, each at least 6 inches in diameter, were bent over and twisted together in a way that couldn't possibly be natural. Some were even broken completely, the wood splintered and fresh. I stopped to photograph the formation. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely hold the camera. That's when I heard it, a deep, guttural sound that started as a low rumble and built into something between a roar and a scream. It echoed through the trees, seeming to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. I've never heard anything like it before or since. It wasn't a bear, wasn't a cougar, wasn't anything I could identify. The sound went on for what felt like forever, but was probably only about 15 seconds. When it stopped, the silence was deafening. Then came the footsteps, heavy, deliberate thuds that made the ground vibrate slightly. Whatever it was moving closer. I raised my camera, more out of instinct than anything else. And that's when I saw it through my viewfinder. About 75 yards away, partially obscured by a massive cedar, was something that shouldn't exist. It was huge. I'm 6'2", and this thing had at least 3 feet on me. The body was massive, covered in dark brown or black hair, but it wasn't like any bear I've ever seen. The proportions were all wrong. It was standing upright, completely vertical, with arms that hung down past its knees. But it was the face that haunts me. Through the viewfinder, I could see it clearly for a split second. It had a flat, almost human-like face, but larger, with deep-set eyes that looked intelligent. That's the only word I can use to describe it. Those eyes weren't animal eyes. There was something behind them. Awareness, calculation. purpose. I managed to press the shutter once before pure panic took over. The sound of the camera seemed to trigger something. The creature turned its head sharply toward me and made this huffing sound that I felt in my chest. Then it took one step forward, moving with an agility that something that size shouldn't possess. I ran. I'm not ashamed to admit it. I turned and ran as fast as I've ever run in my life. I abandoned thousands of dollars worth of photography equipment, dropping everything except my camera, which was still hanging around my neck. Behind me, I could hear it moving through the forest, branches snapping, the ground thundering with each step. But here's the strange part. It never caught up to me, even though it clearly could have. It was herding me, pushing me in a specific direction. Every time I tried to veer toward where I thought my truck was, there would be another one of those horrifying screams, and the footsteps would get closer until I changed course. After what felt like hours but was probably only 20 minutes, I burst out of the woods onto one of the main trails. The footsteps suddenly stopped. When I finally got the courage to look back, there was nothing there, just the endless green of the forest. But I could feel it watching me, waiting to see what I would do. I noticed something then that made my blood run cold. About 20 feet ahead was a small wooden sign marking one of the reservation's sacred areas. I'd been pushed away from it, deliberately guided to this spot. Whatever that thing was, it had been protecting that place. I made it back to my truck on shaking legs, fumbling with my keys so badly it took several tries to get the door open. The whole way back, I felt those eyes on me, tracking my movement until I was well away from whatever I had unknowingly approached. When I got home, I checked my camera. Most of the photos from when I saw the creature were too blurry, just dark smudges against the trees. But there was one, just one, that came out clear enough to see something. I've spent hours staring at it, trying to convince myself it's just a shadow or a trick of the light. But I know what I saw. I went back the next day with a couple of friends to retrieve my equipment. Everything was gone, not scattered like an animal had gotten to it, but completely vanished. The only thing we found was my tripod, placed carefully at the base of one of those twisted trees. The locals I've talked to since then have been reluctant to discuss it, but one elderly Quinault man just nodded when I described what happened. He told me I was lucky, that the Guardian had just been warning me away from sacred ground. He wouldn't say more, but the look in his eyes told me he knew exactly what I'd encountered. I still photograph wildlife, but not in that part of the Olympic Peninsula. Sometimes when I'm processing photos at night, I'll catch myself staring into the dark outside my window, remembering those eyes in the forest. I know there are things in this world we don't understand, ancient things that deserve our respect. Whatever I encountered that day was one of them. I'm not trying to convince anyone of anything. I know how this sounds. Believe me, I've spent months trying to convince myself it was just a bear, just my imagination, just anything other than what I know it was. But I know what I saw. And I know that something intelligent and powerful is out there in those woods, protecting places we were never meant to disturb. The photo is still on my hard drive, buried in a folder I rarely open. Sometimes I think about sharing it, but something tells me I shouldn't. Some things are better left alone, and some boundaries are meant to be respected. Story 21. I've spent the last 3 months trying to make sense of what happened to me on Route 101 near Garberville back in August. I never really believed in Bigfoot before, despite growing up in Humboldt County where the stories are everywhere. But what I experienced that night changed everything I thought I knew about our forests and what lives in them. It was August 12th, around 7:30 p.m. I was driving back from visiting my sister in Eureka, heading south on the 101 in my 2018 Ford F-150. The sun was just starting to set, creating that weird twilight where everything looks a bit off. I remember checking my GPS and seeing I was about 15 minutes north of Garberville when things started getting strange. The first thing I noticed was how quiet it got. I always drive with my windows cracked. I like the fresh air and the sound of the forest. But suddenly, there was this eerie silence. No birds, no crickets, nothing. Just the sound of my truck's engine. At first I didn't think much of it, but then I started seeing movement in the trees along the roadside. It wasn't like seeing a deer or a bear cross the road. I'm used to that. This was different. Something large was moving parallel to my truck, keeping pace at about 35 to 40 miles per hour. The brush was thick, but I could see branches moving and catch glimpses of something dark through the foliage. My first thought was maybe it was a bear, but bears don't run alongside vehicles for extended periods. I slowed down to about 25 miles per hour, thinking whatever it was would either cross the road or disappear into the woods. That's when I got my first clear look at it. About 50 yards ahead, this massive figure stepped partway onto the shoulder of the road. Even in the dying light, I could make out its features clearly. It had to be at least 8 feet tall, covered in dark brown, almost black hair. Its arms hung down past its knees, and its shoulders were incredibly wide, maybe 3-4 feet across. My hands started shaking on the steering wheel. I'm a big guy, 6'2", 220 pounds, but this thing made me feel tiny. What really got to me was how it moved. It wasn't lumbering or awkward like you'd expect something that size to be. It moved with purpose, almost gracefully, despite its massive size. I hit the gas, pushing my truck up to about 50 miles per hour. In my rearview mirror, I could see it actually running after me. Not like in movies where monsters chase cars at highway speeds. This was real. It was keeping pace at 45 to 50 miles per hour through the forest parallel to the road, which is terrifying enough on its own. I knew there was an old logging town coming up, one of those half-abandoned places where maybe 20 people still live. I figured if I could make it there, the creature would back off. But as I approached the town's limits, marked by an old faded sign, it didn't stop. If anything, it seemed more aggressive, moving closer to the road. The town itself was just a collection of maybe 15 buildings, most of them boarded up. The only light came from 2 street lamps and a single house with its porch light on. I pulled into what used to be a gas station, the gravel crunching under my tires. My hands were shaking so bad I could barely put the truck in park. That's when things got even weirder. Instead of backing off at the sight of buildings and lights, the creature circled the gas station. I could hear its footsteps, heavy thuds that seemed to vibrate through my truck. The street lamp cast enough light that I could see it more clearly now. Its face was surprisingly flat, almost human-like, but with a prominent brow ridge. Its eyes reflected the light like a cat's, glowing slightly in the darkness. What really struck me was its behavior. This wasn't just some animal reacting on instinct. It was studying me, studying the truck. It would move from one building to another, always keeping me in sight. At one point, it picked up what looked like an old metal barrel and moved it like it was clearing a path. That's when I realized this thing was showing signs of intelligence I never would have expected. I sat in my truck for what felt like hours, but was probably about 45 minutes, according to my truck's clock. The creature maintained its patrol of the area, sometimes disappearing behind buildings only to reappear somewhere else. It seemed to be establishing some kind of perimeter, marking territory in a way I'd never seen any animal do before. What finally ended the encounter was a logging truck passing through on the main road. The noise seemed to startle the creature, and it retreated into the forest. But it didn't just run away. It moved back methodically, maintaining eye contact with me until it disappeared into the tree line. I waited another 30 minutes before I dared to move. My hands were still shaking as I put the truck in drive. As I pulled back onto the main road, I could see movement in the trees again, but further back this time. The creature followed me for another mile or so before finally disappearing. The thing that's been keeping me up at night isn't just the encounter itself, it's what it implies. This wasn't some animal avoiding human contact. This thing followed me into a populated area, showed problem-solving intelligence, and demonstrated territorial behavior right on the edge of human civilization. I've talked to some locals since then, and I'm not the only one who's noticed these creatures getting bolder. 3 weeks after my encounter, I drove back to that same town in daylight. I found massive footprints around the old gas station, 16 inches long and deeply impressed in the hard ground. But what really chilled me was finding similar tracks leading right up to the edge of Garberville proper. These creatures aren't just surviving alongside us, they're expanding their territory, adapting to our presence in ways that both fascinate and terrify me. I've always been skeptical of Bigfoot stories, always looked for the logical explanation, but there's no explaining this away. What I encountered that night wasn't just some undiscovered animal. It was something intelligent, something that's learning to navigate the boundaries between its world and ours. And from what I've seen, those boundaries are getting thinner every day. I still drive that route sometimes. I have to for work. But I don't drive it at night anymore, and I always carry a high-powered flashlight and a camera now. Sometimes, when I pass that old gas station, I can feel eyes on me from the tree line, and sometimes, just sometimes, I catch glimpses of movement in my peripheral vision that remind me of that night. The worst part is the uncertainty. Did it follow me because I was in its territory? Or was it studying me, learning about human behavior just as much as I was trying to understand it? I don't have answers, but I know one thing for certain. These creatures are out there, and they're adapting to us faster than we realize. Story 22. I'm a wildlife photographer from Port Angeles, and I've spent countless hours in the Olympic National Park. That morning started like any other. I left my house around 5 a.m. to catch the early morning light. The weather was typical for the Pacific Northwest. Overcast, misty, with patches of fog rolling through the ancient trees. Temperature was around 45 degrees Fahrenheit, and there was this eerie stillness in the air that I initially attributed to the heavy cloud cover. I parked my truck at the visitor center lot around 6 a.m. There were only two other vehicles there, a ranger's truck and what looked like a research vehicle with University of Washington tags. I grabbed my gear, Canon EOS R5, couple of lenses, tripod, water, protein bars, and my usual safety kit, logged my planned route at the trailhead station, and headed out on the Hall of Mosses Trail. My plan was to branch off onto some of the less traveled paths once I got deeper in, looking for Roosevelt elk in the morning light. The first hour was uneventful. I got some decent shots of nurse logs and the morning mist through the canopy. But around 7:30 a.m., something felt different. You know how the forest usually has this constant background noise, birds, small animals, wind in the trees. All of that just stopped. At first I thought maybe a cougar was in the area. That often causes wildlife to go quiet. But this felt different. The silence was absolute, and there was this pressure in the air, like right before a massive thunderstorm. I remember checking my phone's weather app, thinking maybe I'd missed a storm warning, but there was no signal, typical for that area. That's when I noticed the first strange thing. About 30 feet up in a massive Sitka spruce, there was this weird arrangement of broken branches. Now, I've seen plenty of natural branch breaks and storm damage, but this was different. The branches were woven together in a way that looked deliberate, forming what appeared to be some kind of platform or nest structure. But it was way too big for eagles or any other local wildlife I knew of. As I was photographing the structure, I still have these photos, I heard what I can only describe as wood knocking against wood. 3 distinct knocks, followed by 2 more after a pause. It came from somewhere to my left, maybe 100 yards away. Then, almost immediately, there was a response from the opposite direction, the same pattern, 3 knocks, pause, 2 knocks. I've been in these woods for 15 years, and I've never heard anything like it. My initial reaction was to rationalize it, maybe woodpeckers or some rangers doing trail work. But then I noticed something that made my blood run cold. About 50 yards ahead of me, partially hidden behind a massive fallen log, was what looked like a head peering over at me. The thing that struck me wasn't just its size, it was huge, but how it moved. It wasn't the jerky movement of a bear or the cautious peek of a deer. This thing moved with purpose, like it was studying me. I raised my camera instinctively, but as soon as I did, it ducked behind the log. That's when I realized. It had anticipated my action. It didn't react to my movement. It moved before I even raised the camera. The level of intelligence in that simple action hit me hard. This wasn't an animal reacting to a threat. This was something that understood what a camera was and didn't want to be photographed. I stood there frozen, for what felt like minutes, but was probably only seconds. Then I heard movement in the underbrush to my right. Whatever was watching me was circling around. I could hear branches being carefully moved aside, but here's the thing. It was moving in perfect sync with the periodic gusts of wind, using the natural sounds of the forest to mask its movement. This wasn't random, this was strategic. The knocking started again, this time closer and from multiple directions. I could feel myself starting to panic, but years of wildlife photography had taught me not to run. Instead, I slowly began backing up toward the main trail. That's when I noticed more of those strange structures in the trees. Not just one or two, but at least 5 that I could see from where I stood. They were all at different heights, all with clear lines of sight to the main game trails. As I was backing away, I stepped on a branch and it snapped loudly in the silence. Immediately, there was a response, a deep rumbling sound that I felt more than heard. It wasn't a growl or a roar. It was almost like the sub-bass you feel at a concert, but organic. My chest actually vibrated with it. Then something happened that I still have trouble explaining. About 80 yards ahead of me, a figure stood up. The thing was massive. I'm 6'2", and this thing had at least 3 feet on me. But it wasn't just its height that was terrifying. It was how it moved. It didn't lumber like a bear or crash through the undergrowth. It stood up smoothly, almost gracefully, and turned to face me directly. Its proportions were humanoid but wrong. Arms too long, shoulders too wide. The hair covering it was a dark reddish-brown, but what struck me most were its eyes. They weren't animal eyes. There was intelligence there, calculation. It took one step forward, and that's when the real terror hit me. As it moved, I saw 2 more figures rise up in my peripheral vision, one on either side, about 60 yards out. They were coordinating, moving to flank me. I've studied predator behavior for years, and this was textbook pack hunting tactics, but at a level that showed clear planning and intelligence. I did the only thing I could think of. I raised my arms slowly, a submissive gesture that sometimes works with primates, and began backing away while speaking in a calm, low voice. I'm leaving. This is your territory. I mean no harm. I know it sounds ridiculous now, but in that moment, it felt like the right thing to do. The response was immediate and incredible. The 2 flanking figures stopped moving. The central figure, the largest one, tilted its head slightly, almost like it was considering me. Then it made a gesture with its right hand, a deliberate sweeping motion toward the main trail. It was letting me leave. I backed away slowly, never turning my back to them. As I reached the main trail, the knocking started again, but this time it was different. It was a complex series of patterns, like they were discussing something. The figures melted back into the forest with an ease that shouldn't be possible for something that size. The whole encounter lasted maybe 15 minutes, but it felt like hours. When I finally made it back to my truck, my hands were shaking so badly I could barely get the key in the ignition. I checked my camera immediately, but the few photos I managed to take just show vague, dark shapes behind trees. Nothing conclusive. Here's what's been haunting me since. Those structures in the trees weren't random. They were positioned strategically, creating a network of observation posts throughout their territory. The way they communicated and coordinated showed not just intelligence, but a complex social structure. They weren't just reacting to my presence. They were studying me, assessing me, and ultimately deciding to let me go. I've gone back to that spot twice since then in groups, but found nothing except more of those tree structures, always too high up to photograph clearly. The rangers I've talked to just give me knowing looks when I mention anything, like they've heard it all before but can't or won't discuss it. I still do wildlife photography in the Olympics, but never alone anymore, and never in that particular section of the Hoh rainforest. Sometimes at night, I can still hear that deep rumbling sound in my dreams, and I wake up wondering what they learned about me during our encounter, and how many other hikers they've studied without ever being seen. The most terrifying part, I'm convinced they're still out there, watching, learning and communicating in ways we don't understand. And the scariest thought of all is that maybe they've been doing this for centuries, gradually adapting and developing strategies to avoid detection while studying us right back. Story 23. It started on October 12th, 2023. I had just finished a contract job setting up networks for a new business complex near Olympic National Park. I'd been in the area for about 2 weeks, staying at a small rental cabin off Highway 101, about 15 minutes from downtown Port Angeles. The cabin backed right up against the forest, which I originally thought was a nice perk, some peace and quiet after long days of work. That Thursday evening I was packing up my equipment, planning to drive back to Seattle the next morning. It was around 6:30 p.m. and the sun was already setting. You know how early it gets dark up here in Washington during fall. I was loading some boxes into my truck when I first noticed something was off. The normal evening sounds, birds, small animals, even the constant wind through the trees, just stopped. It wasn't gradual. It was like someone had hit a mute button on the forest. I've spent enough time outdoors to know that when nature goes quiet, it's usually because something's wrong. I looked around, and that's when I felt it, that sensation of being watched. Not the casual someone glanced my way kind of feeling, but an intense predatory observation that makes your skin crawl. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was studying my every move from the tree line, which was about 50 yards from where I stood. The light was fading fast, but I still had a few things to pack. I grabbed my phone and turned on its flashlight, trying to hurry without looking too panicked. That's when I caught the smell. This overwhelming putrid odor that was like a mix of wet dog, rotting meat, and something else I can't even describe. It was so strong it made my eyes water. Then I heard it, a deep rumbling sound that wasn't quite a growl, but definitely wasn't human. It came from the tree line to my left, maybe 100 feet away. I swung my phone's light in that direction and nearly dropped it. Between two massive Douglas firs, I saw something move, something big. The movement was smooth, almost fluid, but what terrified me was the height. Whatever it was tall enough that its head would have been at least 8 feet off the ground. I'm 6'2", and this thing dwarfed me. In the dim light, I could make out a massive, broad-shouldered silhouette covered in dark hair or fur. But what really got me were the eyes. They caught the light from my phone and reflected back this deep, reddish-amber color. They were too high up to be a bear, and the way it moved was all wrong for any animal I know. I practically threw the remaining equipment in my truck and jumped in the cab. As I started the engine, I heard heavy footsteps, not running but deliberate walking, moving parallel to my driveway. I gunned it out of there, gravel spraying everywhere. In my rearview mirror, I swear I saw not one but 2 large figures step onto the driveway, watching my truck speed away. I should have just driven straight to Seattle. That's what any sane person would have done. But I had a paid-up room at the Red Lion Hotel in Port Angeles, and I convinced myself I was just spooked. Urban areas are safe, right? That's what I kept telling myself. God, I was wrong. I checked into the hotel around 7:30 p.m., still shaking but trying to rationalize what I'd seen. My room was on the 3rd floor, overlooking the parking lot and a small wooded area behind the hotel. I ordered some delivery food, took a hot shower, and tried to calm down. Around 9 p.m., I started hearing weird noises from the parking lot. At first, I thought it was just people loading or unloading cars, but the sounds were off. Heavy footsteps on pavement, but with an odd cadence that didn't match human walking patterns. And that smell, that same horrible, distinctive odor from earlier, was somehow reaching me on the 3rd floor. I went to the window and looked down. The parking lot was well lit, but there were dark areas between the light poles. That's when I saw them. 2 massive figures moving between the cars, staying just at the edge of the light. They moved with this terrible purpose, methodically checking the parking lot, almost like they were searching for something, or someone. My blood ran cold when I realized they were moving in a pattern that was bringing them closer to the hotel entrance. Their size was even more apparent in the urban setting. They had to duck under the parking lot lights, which I know are at least 12 feet high. Their movements were too coordinated, too intelligent to be any kind of animal I'd ever heard of. I started documenting everything on my phone, hands shaking so bad I could barely hold it steady. The video came out too dark and shaky to make out much, but the audio picked up these low vocalizations they were making to each other. Not quite speech, but definitely communication. It was like deep, rhythmic huffing sounds mixed with what I can only describe as wood knocking against wood, even though we were in a parking lot. Around 10:30 p.m., I heard movement in the hallway outside my room. Not normal hotel noises. These were heavy footsteps, and that smell was getting stronger. Something large moved past my door, making the floor creak in a way that shouldn't be possible in a modern hotel. I heard the emergency exit door at the end of the hall open and close. I spent the next few hours in absolute terror, listening to them moving around the building. They seemed to be systematically checking every possible entrance. I could hear them on the fire escape, in the stairwells, even on the roof at one point. The worst part was realizing they were intelligent enough to understand how buildings work. They weren't just wandering, they were hunting. Around 2 a.m. things got even worse. The power in the hotel flickered and went out. The emergency lights kicked in, but the parking lot lights were dead. In that moment of darkness, I heard multiple car alarms go off simultaneously. Through my window, I could see car windows being smashed. They were destroying vehicles, methodically, purposefully, like they were looking for something specific. I called the police, trying to keep my voice steady. They said they were getting multiple calls about vandalism and strange noises, but by the time they arrived 15 minutes later, the creatures had vanished. The cops found 8 cars with smashed windows and deep scratches in the metal, scratches that started at heights no human could reach. The police report blamed it on bears, even though bears don't typically coordinate attacks or understand building layouts. They definitely don't systematically search hotels or specifically target vehicles. The next morning, I found large footprints in a muddy area behind the hotel, at least 18 inches long and twice as wide as my own foot. They showed clear dermal ridges, like human fingerprints, but on a massive scale. I drove straight to Seattle as soon as the sun came up, but this experience has haunted me ever since. These weren't just random animals. They followed me from the forest into the city, coordinated their movements, and demonstrated an understanding of human structures that terrifies me. They're adapting to urban environments, learning how we live, and worst of all, they're getting bold about it. I've since learned that Port Angeles has had a spike in similar incidents over the past year: missing pets, property damage, strange noises at night. Most people blame teenagers or homeless people, but I know what I saw. These creatures aren't just forest dwellers anymore. They're expanding their territory, and our cities aren't the safe havens we think they are. I still have the audio recordings from that night, and sometimes I listen to them just to remind myself I'm not crazy. Those vocalizations, that coordinated movement, the intelligence they displayed, it all points to something that shouldn't exist, something that's evolving and adapting right under our noses. I've moved away from Washington since then, but I still wake up some nights, heart pounding, when I hear heavy footsteps outside my window. The scariest part isn't just what I experienced. It's the realization that these creatures are learning, adapting, and possibly spreading. Port Angeles was just the beginning, and I can't shake the feeling that they're still out there, getting closer to other cities, other populations. Sometimes I wonder if anyone else has experienced something similar but stays quiet for fear of ridicule. All I know is that the line between wilderness and civilization isn't as clear as we think it is, and there are things out there that are far more intelligent and dangerous than we're prepared to admit. Story 24. I never thought I'd be sharing this, but what happened to me at Lake Crescent last October has been eating away at me. I've always been a rational person. I work in IT, spend most of my time dealing with concrete problems and logical solutions. But what I experienced over those 12 hours has completely changed my understanding of what's possible. It was October 15th, 2023. I'd rented a small cabin on the north shore of Lake Crescent in Washington State, about 3 miles from the nearest town. I needed some time away from screens and deadlines, and the fall colors were supposed to be spectacular. The cabin was pretty isolated. The closest neighbor was about half a mile away, and thick forest surrounded it on 3 sides, with the lake stretching out to the south. The day started normally enough. I arrived around 2 p.m., unpacked my supplies, and spent some time getting settled. The weather was typical for October in the Olympic Peninsula: overcast, misty, with temperatures in the low 50s. The cabin was rustic but comfortable: 1 bedroom, a small kitchen, and a living room with large windows facing the lake. The first weird thing I noticed was around 4 p.m. I was sitting on the back deck with a book and a cup of coffee when I realized how quiet it had gotten. I mean, absolutely silent. No birds, no squirrels, not even insects. In the Pacific Northwest, that's not normal. There's usually constant background noise from wildlife. The silence was so sudden and complete that it felt like someone had pressed a mute button on the world. That's when I got that feeling. You know, that primal sensation of being watched. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, and I had this overwhelming urge to go inside. I scanned the tree line but didn't see anything obvious. Just shadows between the trees and that thick mist that seems to hang around Lake Crescent. I went inside and tried to shake it off, but as the afternoon wore on, things got stranger. Around 5:30 p.m., I was in the kitchen preparing an early dinner when I heard what sounded like wood knocking against wood, 3 distinct knocks, followed by a pause, then 2 more. It came from the forest to the east of the cabin. Before I could process what I was hearing, there was an answering series of knocks from the west side, the same pattern, 3 knocks, pause, 2 knocks. My hands were shaking as I turned off the stove. I'm not someone who scares easily, but something about those knocks felt deliberate, intelligent. I grabbed my phone to record any more sounds, but of course they stopped as soon as I was ready. As dusk approached, around 6:15 p.m., the smell hit me. If you've ever been near a landfill on a hot day, or walked past roadkill that's been sitting in the sun, it was like that, but mixed with something musky, almost like wet dog but far more pungent. The odor seemed to come in waves, getting stronger then fading away, as if whatever was producing it was moving around the cabin's perimeter. That's when I started seeing them. Not clearly at first, just dark shapes moving between the trees. They were huge, much bigger than any black bear I'd ever seen, and they moved with an unsettling purpose. I counted at least 3 distinct figures circling the cabin, keeping just inside the tree line where the mist made it hard to get a clear look. But at 7:23 p.m., I remember checking my phone obsessively by this point, one of them stepped partially out of the trees. Even in the failing light, I could see it clearly through the living room window. It had to be at least 8 feet tall, with massive shoulders and long arms that hung below its knees. The fur was a dark reddish-brown, matted in some places. But it was the way it moved that really got to me. Not like an animal, but with an almost human deliberateness. The creature stood there for maybe 30 seconds, just staring at the cabin. Then it did something I'll never forget. It reached up and grabbed a branch about 9 feet off the ground, snapped it off with barely any effort, and placed it on the ground, pointing directly at the cabin. After that, it melted back into the forest. Over the next few hours, I witnessed what I can only describe as some kind of ritual. The creatures, and I'm certain there were at least 5 of them now, would emerge one at a time, each breaking branches and arranging them in increasingly complex patterns on the ground. They seemed to be establishing some kind of boundary, with the cabin at the center. The knocking continued intermittently, but now it was accompanied by other sounds, deep, guttural vocalizations that seemed to carry meaning. They weren't random animal noises. There was a clear pattern of call and response. One would make a series of sounds, and another would answer from a different direction, often followed by movement or the placement of more branches. Around 9 p.m., I witnessed something that made me question everything I thought I knew about these creatures. 2 of them emerged into a small clearing about 50 yards from the cabin. In the beam of my flashlight, I could see them clearly. They were facing each other, and the larger one, easily 9 feet tall, was making deliberate hand gestures. The smaller one was watching intently, occasionally nodding its massive head in what looked eerily like understanding. The real terror set in when I realized they were communicating about me. Every few minutes, one would glance toward the cabin, make more gestures, and the other would respond. They were studying me, discussing me, maybe even planning something. I felt like a bug under a microscope. Throughout all of this, I was too terrified to leave. The cabin felt like the only safe space, though I knew how fragile that safety was. These creatures could have easily broken in if they wanted to, but they seemed more interested in establishing boundaries and observing. The activity peaked around midnight. All 5 creatures emerged from different points around the cabin, forming a rough pentagon. They began a series of coordinated movements, stepping forward, then back, making those hand gestures and vocalizing in what seemed like a predetermined sequence. It lasted about 15 minutes, and then, as if on cue, they all melted back into the forest. After that, things gradually quieted down. The knocking became less frequent, the shapes in the forest more distant. By 2 a.m., even that overwhelming sense of being watched had diminished. When dawn finally came, I practically ran to my car. Before I left, I forced myself to check the areas where I'd seen them arranging branches. Everything was exactly as I'd witnessed. Complex patterns of broken branches laid out in geometric shapes, centered around the cabin. Some of the branches were thickness of my arm, snapped like twigs. I also found footprints, massive ones, 16 inches long at least, deeply pressed into the soft earth. But what really struck me were the patterns. They weren't random tracks. They formed perfect circles around certain trees and parallel lines leading from one arranged pattern of branches to another. It's been months now, and I still can't make sense of what I saw. These weren't just animals acting on instinct. They displayed intelligence, social organization, and what looked like cultural behaviors. They were testing boundaries, communicating and performing what appeared to be ritual activities. I've gone back to my normal life, but I can't shake the feeling that what I witnessed was just a tiny glimpse into something much bigger. A hidden society with its own rules, customs and hierarchy, existing right alongside ours but just out of sight. The strangest part? I checked the cabin